Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a Rocky Mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Saturday, June 13th, Sunday, June 14th for those of you across the pond and beyond. Welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I'm so glad you guys could join us tonight. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and I hope you guys had an awesome and relaxing week. I hope you weren't burning up too much. It was pretty hot and kind of muggy here. The storm's trying to roll in. But thank you again for joining us tonight on one of our many outlets. You can find us live at Spreaker.com under We Are Paradox Media. You can also find us on Periscope, Twitter, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, CastBox, Tumblr, YouTube, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Deezer, as well as Podcast Addict. So tonight I have a treat for all my guys and gals out there. Tonight we will be talking to and getting to know Mr. Jim Moses. And the show tonight is called Making Sense Out of the Senseless, Where to Go From Here. And Jim says, we find ourselves conceptually apprehended by the most reckless, cognitively confused times in his entire life. Having been alive during most of the 60s, that's saying a lot. He does know exactly why it's happening, what desperately needs to happen next, and he'll be sharing further details to attempt to provide far greater clarity, comprehension of seemingly incomprehensible circumstances tonight. So James, aka Jim Moses, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks again, Tessa. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about this because it certainly has affected me in ways that are really hard to articulate, having seen as much history as I have and having an appreciation for history in general. I think the more that we can really look deeper into the motivations and how people are behaving the way that they are, removed of the concerns that are being voiced, the better off we'll be. I can't sit here and tell you that you're necessarily going to be satisfied by the end of my presentation of this show. You know, I figure I'm going to be on for at least 2 hours anyways talking about these things, but I know that there are a lot of very, very concerned people out there, millions of them, and understandably so. We have never seen times like this in our lives at all. There's just nothing to compare to them. Not the 60s, not the riots over Rodney King, not the World Trade Center tower, although that certainly comes close. We have never, ever, ever seen this level of, what's the word, off-the-leash behavior, I guess is a good way of putting it. I don't mean to suggest that means anything derogatory. It's just the level of uninhibited behavior. I've never seen it. I've never, ever seen anything like it. But what I'd like to do is start off with, as I noted in the introduction you gave, start off with the very beginning. My father would have been 107 years old a week from Monday. He was born in international waters off the coast of Cuba, native Spaniard, but more specifically Galician Spaniard, which is to say Proto-Portuguese, because Portugal arose from Galicia. It was kind of a breakaway country in a lot of ways. There are interesting twists to Galicia that people would say, this can't be Spain. The Basques certainly are part of it, the Spanish Basques as opposed to the French Basques, or they're in their native tongue, they're called, or the language more accurately is called Euskaran. And they have, as anybody who is familiar with European history, a propensity for rebellion. So that part of my nationality definitely comes through. I am something of a rebel in my own way, more in terms of ideas and presentation. But he was born in 1913, same year that the Federal Reserve was created, under somewhat deceptive grounds, or on somewhat deceptive grounds, and basically had to prove, came from a large family, and had to prove the fact that he belonged in America, for lack of a better term. I think that there is a natural predisposition to overcompensate because you're always in a position where there are going to be doubts, there are going to be preconceptions involved, which aren't necessarily accurate. And he certainly developed a bit of a chip on his shoulder, had a propensity for being abusive, verbally abusive more than anything else. He rarely, if ever, raised a hand, but he also had some rather bizarre practices which have affected me to this date as to go, as far as discipline goes, and I'm not necessarily sure he was really ready for fatherhood. But that said, the 60s were a wondrous time in their own way. There's just no other way to put it. Everything you've heard is true and then some. I was very young to be able to really have a full appreciation of them, but I got enough that I really understood, especially in retrospect. The music was amazing, a lot of it, from 65 on. Certainly some of the stuff beforehand was a little less than inspirational, but it had its charms, I suppose, depending upon, again, what you like as with respect to genres. There was certainly a racial unrest, a lot of uprisings going on. I did see it in my own life. Started out in a very white community, very well-to-do community near the state line of Connecticut and Massachusetts. And I never really fit in there, all things being equal. I never felt like I belonged there for the most part. And there was an awful lot of abuse because there were perceptions that weren't necessarily accurate. Again, perhaps I don't remember all the details. I only know that you were dealing with some very nasty kids. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was an angel either, but there was an awful lot of strife. The marriage started to break apart near the end of the 60s, catalyzed an interest in the Civil War, which definitely informs my appreciation of what's going on right now. I do have a belief, I've articulated it, and other people who are more oriented towards the New Age and paranormal, that there was a mass reincarnation. However much someone believes in reincarnation, my idea is a little bit different now, as you are aware from previous shows, that there was a mass reincarnation in all those people, both African Americans and Caucasians, that were alive back in the Civil War, which would have been 1861 up to 1865. They reincarnated to be able to try to resolve those issues, to be able to really address, because something a lot of people may not be aware of is that the years after the Civil War, there was a very big burst of upward mobility for African Americans as a result of Abraham Lincoln's work and, to a certain extent, Ulysses S. Grant, who is maybe this country's greatest president without anybody knowing it, at the very least one of its best, most competent, most insightful. And unfortunately, Andrew Johnson, who was the de facto successor to Lincoln after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, really did not end up making Grant's job easier. So in a way, Grant was the de facto president. Johnson really did not do a lot, and the Reformation just completely fell flat on its face. The years after, immediately after the Civil War, you had blacks being elected to Congress, elected to public office around their communities. You had a real desire to reunite the country. The problem is twofold. Number one, the people that killed Lincoln, which unfortunately are associated, the Ku Klux Klan arose from the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was a fragmented Masonic sect. There's no other way to put it. And of course, the whole notion of Freemasonry is not well understood. There is definitely good reason in some instances for there to be distrust, but that's largely because of I don't know what the right word, chapters that just did not uphold some of the most sacred tenets of the tradition. More about that a little bit down the road, because I do want to talk as to what the expression was. There's actually an African American Masonic chapter or lodge, I guess would be the correct word, called I believe the Prince Paul, if I'm not mistaken. I've just learned that within the last few weeks, watching some pretty mind-blowing videos on YouTube. But at any rate, getting back, there was an awful lot of really encouraging things happening in the 60s. You hear about it. It is upheld as a golden age, and with good reason. It bled over to a certain extent about halfway into the 70s, and ironically enough, the end of Vietnam, which was pushed largely by both Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon. Both, I don't know how else to put it, were sociopaths, and Johnson died not long after leaving office because of his deeds, for lack of a better term. He definitely, if he didn't actually contribute to the killing of John F. Kennedy, who did want to get out of Vietnam, by 1965, there would be no one left, no Americans left in Vietnam. That was the game plan, and that, I think, was something that contributed to his death, among a few different things. But that was certainly one of them, in my estimation, because there were billions of dollars at stake for the military-industrial complex, something that Eisenhower alluded to. Back to me, I really was just absorbing in a lot of culture. We had so much at our disposal, so much amazing TV. So some of the production values were now that great, but, you know, when you're 5 years old and it's novel, it doesn't matter that much. I mean, you look back, it's like, how could I have been so engrossed by this? For example, Lost in Space, Irwin Allen, the production values were a little on the laughable side. Star Trek, as it evolved, the original series, definitely, there was an improvement and then a deterioration because they didn't have enough money. NBC was basically starving them financially. But these were some of the things that really excited me, and the music was amazing. You had African Americans blazing incredible new paths. Sly and the Family Stone was certainly one of them. You had Jimi Hendrix, who is, without question, an African-American icon.
Epic.
He's by far... What's that?
I said he was epic. He still today blows my mind.
He was very, very innovative. I will say that. I think that his major contribution was as an innovator with respect to really demonstrating what could be done with an electric guitar, and absolutely no one really comparable to him. The analogy that I make, and again, I don't know how much your audience is familiar with jazz. I'm not even that familiar with jazz. It's not my preference, and I'm going to use an analogy with respect to it to really illustrate a certain amount of a misperception where that's concerned. But the analogy I would make is, in a lot of ways, Jimi Hendrix was to the guitar what Miles Davis was to the brass instruments, to the saxophone, to the trumpet, so forth and so on. Very, very free form, very much kind of just letting him, going where he liked, meandering and seeing where the music was taking him, how he was feeling at a given moment determined where he went. Certainly in the case of Eric Clapton, that's a guitarist who is known for really, really, his feel becomes very, very important over the technical aspects. And I think that Hendrix was a blend of both of those. But as for Sly and the Family Stone, they really were, all things being equal, the first multiracial group, primarily African-American, coming out of San Francisco. I can't think of anybody really before that. You have some great bands. I can't overlook the groups that were coming out of Motown, and Holland Dozier Holland, the greatest, if not the greatest, certainly among the greatest songwriters of all time. Lamont, Brian Holland, and I can't remember what Brian's brother's name was, but they were responsible for some of the greatest Motown songs. You name them, and almost always they were the ones that wrote it, up to, say, about 67 or 68. And then you started to see other writers come along that were contributing. And certainly you had musicians, songwriters that could just absolutely, with very, very, doing with very little compared to today, it's almost laughable when you look at how much equipment is involved, even though there is this DIY perception. And certainly some of the independent groups today are using very, comparatively simple setups to produce their material. But when you really take a look at how creative these people were, certainly George Martin with the Beatles is a very good example, but also Holland Dozier Holland and Berry Gordy at Motown, for better or worse. He was a bit of a slave driver, and that created problems. It's one of the reasons why the Temptations fragmented, that the Four Tops left, that Holland Dozier Holland left and ended up blazing their own trail. Some of my all-time favorite soul funk music is their two labels, Invictus and Hot Wax. But you begin to see a diversification occurring around 1969 or 70, and there's just an explosion of music, stuff that it's in my blood. I've sung it at karaoke. I sang for 20 years pretty much steady, doing karaoke, doing a lot of soul songs because they had affected me to that extent. To have the opportunity to be able to communicate and really replicate to a great extent, perhaps not completely because, again, I'm not African American, but I'm not so far removed vocally to not be able to at least convey some of that feel. To have that opportunity to communicate it to some kids, younger kids especially, who had never heard this stuff, is still one of the biggest highs I've ever experienced. It's hard to put into words how you're going to be affected if this music has affected you to that extent. And this does tie in with the direction I'm going in, because we really need to take a good look at what happened to music to understand a lot of what just has transpired within the last 2 weeks. You had a situation where music was being made largely for the sake of creating art up until the general consensus is 1977. By the end of 76, you started to see the dwindling of really good soul music. You had your moments, there's no doubt about it. Brothers Johnson being an example. The Commodores were very consistent, as was Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Smokey Robinson.
Prince was just What's that?
Smokey Robinson. Like he was.
Oh yeah, I mean
forever.
Smokey certainly was his solo. He's another one. He was a very big contributor at Motown, and I don't want to overlook him. He had a lot to say himself. His solo career was really starting to get going around the mid '70s. He had Quiet Storm. He had a few different things. One of my favorites from 1980 was Cruisin'. It has a lilt to it that, again, is not so far removed from a lot of the Motown sound, but you begin to hear him diversifying just a little bit with that. Mm-hmm. And he starts to go into songs like Being With You, which is more of an 80s creation, but it has a 70s vibe to it. But yeah, Prince basically started in the late 70s. It's something that a lot of people don't remember. His first album was called For You, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. That was 79. I Want to Be Your Lover was his first single. And I am not the biggest Prince fan, but I have got to acknowledge he is absolutely one of the greatest musicians who ever lived, bar none. Multi-talented on so many different levels, a very good songwriter for the most part. I think that with just the sheer volume of songs that he wrote, it's hard to know, and supposedly there are hundreds still in the vault that are supposed to be released. I don't know when that starts again, but I do know that there are plans to release a lot of it. How good it is, hard to say. But at the same time, my point is that you're dealing with a culture that really was focusing, even then in the late 70s, on trying to produce art. The problem is that it became the business really started to intrude into the art around 77. It even actually started in 76. Frampton Comes Alive and Boston both sold just an immense amount of records, and then along comes Rumors, and it's just, off to the races. Problem being is the more that it became a business, the more there was really a tendency to lose sight of what was accomplished and really what wasn't. I'm not going to mince words here. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this before in previous conversations. Doesn't necessarily relate completely, but there is a relationship relative to the effects of resonant information on mixed media, you know what I'm saying, of varying densities. And that is why, in accompanying specific events in someone's life, the sentimental aspect of some things, and the ability to connect certain songs as well as other media, but definitely music because of the immediacy involved, to events in one's life does have a bearing. Rap's first real group was back in '72, and it was called The Last Poets. And I am not a fan of rap, and the reason why I will get into at some length, because I think it's important to understand what exactly rap is. Hip-hop to a lesser extent. Hip-hop at least is somewhat more rooted in what is quote-unquote called music. Last Poets came along in '72 pretty much as an artifact of the tone poems of the '50s, kind of morphing as the '60s went on, also certainly in terms of a lot of the poetry. It was the African Americans' response, and I mean it was certainly something that was distinctive in as much that it really went out of its way to stand out, and there was an acknowledgement that it was separate from music at that moment in time. You had other groups. You had a group called Mandrill, which was more jazz-rooted, and the connection between jazz and rap cannot be overlooked, and hip-hop. Again, the free-form element, talking about Miles Davis, there's not a lot of structure, or in the instance of rap, it evolved into there being just way too much structure, where there was a very rigid sort of thing going on, not necessarily in the words, but in the sonic aspect. The sonic arrangements tend to be very, very rigid with rap. And there, again, I will tell you why I think that is. I don't know what exactly the rationale was. I don't know who made the decision, or if there was more than, if it was kind of a consensus that emerged. Some of the other groups, as I said, Mandrill was one of them. And then you had Gil Scott-Heron, who was also rooted in jazz, but he started pushing the envelope. The Revolution Will Not Be Televised is one of his. Certain group of African Americans really embraced rap because it was a way of kind of almost shocking a large percentage, including their own elders. There was like, you got to listen, we grew a lot of this stuff and, various heritage and a very large percentage African American. It was culture shock, as might be expected. It wasn't that I hadn't seen black people before, but never had been commingling quite so much. The first place we lived could be referred to as a project. And we had a very nice African-American family in back of us, and they had people come over, and it was very organic. And that is a lot, not by itself. I used to listen to music in my father's car, including Latin, Spanish, which was kind of a source of comfort at sometimes if I look back, but other times it got tedious, as you can imagine. When you're hearing a foreign language you really don't understand. But I will tell you, just a humorous aside, whenever in the past, whenever I saw the Saturday Night Live skit, I think it was something La Musica de Led Zeppelin, and it's like, I can relate to that because that's pretty much the exact same voice that the announcer would use. He'd say it in Spanish, so I can certainly relate to that in a lot of ways. I think there was an element of comfort from the reference point in a way, although I've never identified. It's not my primary source of identification. I don't say, the Spanish aspect is something that was not, for whatever reason, my immediate thing I'd point to with respect to heritage, although I certainly was glad for it, especially as I got older. But what I was going to say also is that, there was just a ton of music on AM radio, so much music. Every week you would just have these amazing, amazing songs, stuff that I refer to as hymns as far as I'm concerned. That's how precious they are to me. And you just had, for years, week after week after week, some of the greatest music that has ever been made. I don't know how else to put it. One of the greatest African American anthems came out in '73. I'm going to be trying because you're not in a position where you can play some of the songs that would be illustrative of what I'm talking about. But in my estimation, I've sung it more than a few times at karaoke. Living for the City by Stevie Wonder it's a masterpiece. There's just no other way to put it. In terms of accomplishment, there is almost nothing that compares to it. I have
about
to say that.
karaoke, and I love karaoke, and I'm trying to place this song. Could you sing us a line of it?
Oh, man, you're putting me on the spot now.
You're on TNT karaoke. Let's go. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to.
Well, I'll start off from the beginning. And again, forgive me. It's been a while since I've been in front of a mic, and the mic really is what gives you the courage, not the alcohol. Don't let anybody tell you different, although I guess there's equal parts. The beginning of it goes, a boy is born in Hot Time, Mississippi, surrounded by four walls that ain't so pretty. And again, I'm not singing it well. I'm just reciting it as much as anything. But that's the first verse.
Yeah, I got it now.
Just enough. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad. I don't want to go any further with that. In another environment, at some point, I would really like to be. No, I know. At some point, I'd like to be in a position where I could share. There are some people that do videos actually of karaoke. And I've had recordings done in the very earliest years of doing it back in 1991, the place that I was going. I've got probably about 14 different tapes, but the problem was my voice wasn't quite good enough. Didn't have a lot of ability to vary because I had issues with I had basically a partially deviated septum. When I removed that, that's when I could really sing a lot of stuff that I had wanted to in a way that was just not possible before then. I certainly was feeling what I was singing. I just don't think it was necessarily being felt by the audience to the same extent. So, but yes, there were a lot of places in those early years of the 70s when we first moved to the city where I had the opportunity to be exposed to African American culture. My first teacher in elementary school, not elementary, but the elementary school in the city, second grade, was African American. Her name was Miss May. And I actually went to school with one of the greatest, someone who's acknowledged by a large percentage of musicians who play the guitar, certainly, but also people that are in the know when it comes to guitar. I went to school with Tony McAlpine. He was a year ahead of me. I actually attended one of his recitals in a fourth grade class, and it is surreal to have somebody of that stature living in your neighborhood. You live two streets away from me. So
yeah, I mean, for those who don't know, who's Tony?
Tony was involved with some of Paul Sheehan, who is a bassist, I believe. Paul Gilbert, Billy Sheehan, excuse me, I stand corrected, from Talos. This is all really independent metal, classical metal, speed metal kind of stuff, which I'm not necessarily into any great extent. Some of it I like, but I didn't necessarily gravitate towards a lot of that stuff because it was just way too intense. We're talking Yngwie on turbocharged. If that analogy helps at all, Yngwie Malmsteen.
Yeah,
some other people too. What's that?
Energizer Bunny.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, and it isn't that Tony necessarily played that fast, but a lot of the people around him. Paul Gilbert was involved, who of course went on to be with Mr. Big. Billy Sheehan was with Mr. Big too. I don't remember who was their guitarist off the top of my head, but Tony never really was part of the mainstream. I think at one point he was involved with a group called Racer X, if I'm not mistaken. Point being, and actually he survived cancer, just as an aside. Point being is that he is one of the all-time great African-American guitarists. There are others. You have Ernie Isley, who is, in my estimation, he's in a lot of ways, I think he's better than Jimi Hendrix in terms of playing, in terms of just being able to create something, very much, I think, a jazz vibe going on with him, too. But, I mean, if you want a sample, do you know the song by the Isley Brothers, That Lady?
Ooh, that lady.
That's the one, and his guitar is what ends up distinguishes that. It is very, very, without his guitar, it is not the same song. I mean, he is there aren't enough words I can use for just how phenomenal a guitarist Ernie Isley is. And I would recommend, I can share the title track, not the title track, but the lead-off track from his one solo album called High Wire from 1991, Song for the Muses. And I mean, it is like the guitar you hear from that lady, just, it's a smorgasbord of it, every different variation you can think of. And there were other guitarists that followed in his stead, kind of imitated him to an extent. But point being is that he's another one. You have, if you're familiar with any of the Ohio Players song, Fire, Love Roller Coaster, which is still one of it's just a jaw-dropping hook. There's just no other way to put it.
Is that the one that Red Hot Chili Peppers remade?
It is. It is the cover. They did a cover of that. They did a cover of that. They did a lot of 70s covers. In fact, Anthony and Mike Patton from Faith No More, they both take a lot of their vocal stylings from Chicago. It's not necessarily obvious, but it's there if you recognize the similarities. Chicago influenced a lot of people, and again, they were white, but they had a black vibe, to say the least. The jazz, fusion, rock, it worked for a long time. Terry Kath was Jimi Hendrix's favorite guitarist, bar none. There's no other way to put it. And tragedy in terms of the way that he ended up leaving this world. Just another, the level of talent in the 70s is hard to communicate to someone who was not there. I really can't put it any other way. And I mean, I only got started with my concert going at the latter part of the decade. My first show was Styx with a group called Nantucket, actually from North Carolina, very funky in their own right, in November of 78. So I got a late start, but I mean, there's a lot of things that were coming along. You had Parliament Funkadelic with George Clinton, Bootsy Collins, definitely founding fathers of the funk movement, right up there. You had, I'm trying to think some of the other things. You had Kool and the Gang, which is a very, very important group, yet they and the Commodores both have not been inducted into the Hall of Fame. Yet other groups that just do not hold a candle to them are in there, which is a running theme. It's a problem. Again, one of my problems in terms with the way that the direction has gone is the newest director. I actually ended up putting up a petition on Twitter to get him removed because they ended up inducting the Notorious B.I.G., Christopher Wallace, Biggie Smalls, however you want to, whatever you want to call him. And again, this is no suggestion that the problem being is that Todd Rundgren, who has done more to call attention to some of the greatest African-American artists and music ever made, has been snubbed twice in order to be able to get the Notorious B.I.G. in, who really did not contribute, even in the realm of rap. I don't think he did much. Again, however, whatever the barometer is, it's one thing to have Tupac Shakur inducted and again, I don't necessarily support it. I'm not a fan of having stuff because it's not rock. It's simply not rock and roll. There is not a real relationship to speak of. A lot of acts that have been inducted do not necessarily fit the description. Again, it's all about the attitude in these people's minds, the purists that largely are on the board of directors of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The only reason I bring this up is a lot of people that really are cognizant of what the great music that was made by African Americans and other minorities, certainly Hispanic, Latino, Carlos Santana being a very good example. I think probably he's, Tito Puente, Trini Lopez. There's so much stuff. I mean, even Herb Alpert to an extent, but again, he was not necessarily Latin. He was making Latin music. And I don't know how much of the Tijuana Brass you've heard, but it's timeless music. There's no other way to put it. We're facing a situation that really these times are an echo in some ways of what went on back then, but there's the change in the dynamic. You're dealing with an awful lot of real intimidation is the only word I can use. I dealt, as a result of the chaos in my life, and my brother as well to an extent, although he took a different path to deal with it, we were very much in highly abusive situations. There was no place for me to be able to escape except the music. Without the music, I would not be here. I am a survivor. I'll be honest, it's not something that I like talking about too much. I consider myself to be a survivor of abuse. There's no other way to put it. I did experience racism personally from close family members, but it wasn't something that I certainly ended up having any real resentment about, but it was reflective of the way that I was being treated otherwise because I resembled my father. That's why I chose the drawing that I did as part of the presentation publicizing this appearance, because you can see in the photo, even though I don't like the fact I look way too much like Eddie Munster, there is a resemblance between the two of us, and I took a lot of grief. I heard the word spick, which I think most people now are aware is a lazy contraction of Hispanic or Spanish, which again by itself is very closely rooted to the word Spanish. The whole thing is because I was put in a position, there was the relationship between my mother and father really is indicative of a lot of what was going on at the time. Being divorced in 1969, it was still not something that was widely accepted. So she felt that pressure. We were in a place that, in my mind, was not supportive of a lot of what I was experiencing, especially. My brother, I think, he was a pragmatist. I was a pragmatist to an extent because I didn't have a choice. There was nowhere to go. I really didn't want to go live with my father because it would have been very, very isolating on a lot of levels. He did not interact with almost anybody to speak of, although, having said that, he was kind of for lack of a better term, lapsed Shriner, and we did go to the Christmas parties. He took us to the Melhouse Shrine Circus, and the parades, obviously, the Shriners showed up, and this will become more relevant as I talk more about some of the relationships to what's going on between the Freemasons and some of the scenes, what's going on behind the scenes, because it is related and you can begin to connect the dots once I clarify. But there has been a curiosity, I'll put it that way, with respect to the Masons on my part for a while off and on, but I never was in a position where I felt strongly enough to say, okay, I'm going to join. The whole notion of secret societies is not something that's a natural thing for me. I don't like the whole notion of them. I just don't. Back on track. We were into the 80s, which was not a good time for me at all. It just was not on so many different levels. You saw a very definite, what's the word I want to use? A lot of the 80s came about, and these are things that I've talked to a few different people about over the years, came about as a result of the hangover from Vietnam. The way that we left Vietnam was very, very galling, and it ended up being something where there was a combination of that mortification, for lack of a better term, as well as the desire to just live again, and I think it was already starting to get underway. The 60s, you began to see traces of it where there was a lot more unstructured cultures arising, communes, so forth and so on, and those had good attributes as well as bad attributes. Anybody who studied sociology knows that, and I've got enough of a grasp on both psychology and sociology to understand a lot of it. And in 79, we began to see things start to break down dramatically. It was not a good year. I graduated in 80, and I left I all through the year, all through 79, my senior year into 1980. In fact, I actually ended up trying in my junior year to change a rule where I always had the desire to have a certain amount more freedom than what I had. I always felt like I was in a position where I had enough responsibility to be able to come and go. So one of the rules was seniors could go off campus of our high school downtown in the city, but juniors were not able to. So I fought that, and I was in a mixed grade class, the AV class, and one of my, someone I trusted, a bit of an ally, I guess would be a good way to put it, is an African-American gentleman named Archie Williams, a year ahead of me. And unfortunately, he died a few years ago. I offered my condolences, and that was about the extent of it. But he was someone that I trusted. And the problem is, I'm jumping around all over the place, and I hope I'm not driving everybody out there crazy doing it. You lived, there was a situation when you're living in a city and you are different from, regardless of whether you're African American, Hispanic, Asian, or Caucasian, there is immediately a certain tension that arises. And it isn't because necessarily you wish someone harm. It's the fear factor. Really, there is a fear factor. You cannot deny it. And that's not by accident in some instances, because people do project an image of a more menacing image. I can think of some African American kids that definitely did that, and I know they were doing it deliberately. I remember the names well. And even then, some of them that died, some of them that ended up in prison, I was bummed out. Never in my life did I want to see anybody suffer. This is a running theme. The work that I've been doing for the last several years is because I am trying to prevent people from suffering if at all possible. This goes back to my childhood. I had a very strong reverence for life. I was somehow in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the abuse, somehow my brother and I turned out to be good people. It's almost miraculous in my mind, not because I think that I would have been a bad person, but a lot of other people in the same circumstances, as I think we've seen to an extent the last 2 weeks, they would have ended up just completely, absolutely going off. You know what I'm saying? It would have been almost an excuse to do so. And there are a lot of people that make that excuse. But I will say this, for all the crap we took, we never went out of our way to hurt people, ever. I never used the N-word, never, not once that I can remember, and I don't think that there was ever. I knew it was a word that I should not use for whatever reason. You know what I'm saying? And all it really is, just to clarify that too, and I think people are aware of this, but I mean, it's a corruption of the Spanish word for black. That's really all it is. For Negro. Negro means black, negra in Spanish. And nigger is basically a slang way of saying negra. That's really it. You know what I'm saying? Or Negro. But at the same time, I knew it was a sensitive subject for the same reason that I, knew that spick was not something that I should welcome someone saying to me or calling me. So I never used it. And this is not about me patting myself on the back. I'm only saying there was a lot going on, and there were a lot of people. There was a lot of abuse. Kids were getting abused. You were starting to see more and more parents divorcing. So there were more single parent homes, and it was not something that these kids were used to. So they ended up acting out, and I took a fair amount of grief for it. I was abused a lot, bullied, and I was not a fighter. I only was in 2 fights all my childhood or my adolescence. One I just came out of nowhere, and I don't remember the person that I was involved with. That was on the way home from junior high school, if I'm not mistaken. We walked a fair distance to get there. But the other one was an African-American kid who just for whatever reason decided to go off on me, and I still to this day don't know what was the trigger. I fought with words because that was what I was best at. I had a vocabulary I needed to express because I had been jerked around. It is hard to explain what it's like to be manipulated from all sides. There's no refuge. There's no sanctuary. So you basically are not in a position to respond well. And if there are expectations for you to respond in a certain way, which goes right to what's gone on the last 2 weeks, if you don't respond a certain way, you suffer. Bullies make you suffer because you don't meet their expectations. You don't dance. I don't dance. I have never danced. I don't play games. I have no patience for that. So I suffered because of the fact that I partially because I had no idea what the right response was or what was going to be the most well received, because I was just traumatized. I mean, really, at the end of the day, what I say to people is, I have PTSD as a result of that. I've been recovering ever since. At the same time, I ended up when I left high school, I basically began and have for 4 decades, for 40 years. 2020, it's 40 years. I have been a source of advice, of counsel, and I've gotten good at it because I know what people need to hear in the way that they need to hear it. It is my way of giving back. One more way that people don't have to beat themselves up too much and that other people don't suffer as a consequence. We now have a situation which has evolved. There's a lot of manipulation going on behind the scenes, a lot of very, very powerful bullies. We've talked about them. Bill Gates certainly is one. The families in Europe, the bank, the ones that are controlling the banks are driving a lot of this. We know now, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it was a pandemic. You can't come to any other conclusion when they basically say, oh, it's okay to be out and about, commingling, however you want to characterize it, protesting, rioting, looting, beating people up. Oh, that's just fine. The way that I was brought up, this is just so difficult for me to understand, so difficult on so many levels. It is wrong. I have a very well-defined sense of right and wrong, and to see the amount of equivocation that's gone on the part of people who absolutely should know better, but this is part of the problem that's been developing for 25, 30 years minimum. Certainly, I think from 1990 on, you started to see the beginnings of a really accelerated what I refer to as de-evolution. In my estimation, humanity is devolving on certain levels, and I think there are environmental factors involved that we've talked about before, I think, in previous shows. But what I want to say is that you're dealing with a situation where there has been such a catastrophic failure on the part of elected officials, just not even remotely. I don't know how to put this, but it feels like life has never been cheaper in mine. People are being killed with abandon right now, and it is appalling to me on so many different levels seeing what's happening. Andrew Cuomo can basically issue an edict and contribute to the premature deaths of 12,000 people. A lot of them African Americans or minorities that did not deserve to die, but they were sentenced. They basically were effectively handed a death sentence. There's no other way to put it. So what exactly happens when somebody ends up contributing to 12,000 deaths? What can be done? I mean, certainly he should never hold elected office again. I personally think he should be in prison for the rest of my life, or his life. Probably his life for all things. You know what I'm saying. But you have a situation where, almost all the Democratic leadership, all the politicians on the Democratic side have more or less stopped just short of echoing the line from Disco Inferno, "Burn, baby, burn." I can't understand how it's constructive to be destroying minority-owned businesses, a simple source of stability for them, for their communities, to allow this to continue for unabated, and really no attempt to clarify this is wrong. People who have half a brain know this is wrong. They know this is evil. And when I say evil, it means the most basic expression of animalistic impulses, the deference to them under the worst of circumstances. That's really what evil is, as I've said, and the expression of it is the perpetuation of unnatural need. Is there racism today? Yes. Is it systemic? No. I think that it's more about class. I think that more than anything else is the bigger issue. I think economic station becomes a critical consideration. I think that this economic model cannot continue. We know this. It was not going to continue, but now as a result of this pandemic, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion, and I don't think that's an accident either. Hard to explain why they would end up crashing it deliberately. I think a lot of it is to assume control. I think that to have far, far more ability to derive obscene amounts of income from people who are basically a captive audience, for lack of a better term. And they've been manipulated so much that there's no way for them to even have the wits to recognize what's happening. They do on a certain level, but they don't know the specifics. They don't understand who really is driving this. And let me clarify, I don't pretend to be the biggest Donald Trump fan, but he is not the problem so much as it is the Democratic Party. They have really created this situation. The university system has failed miserably when you have professors basically condoning the destruction of history because, well, whatever weird rationale, but as somebody who was brought up to be a preservationist, who loves history, who hates seeing destruction, even as a child I hated seeing it. It was painful for me. I didn't like it when people destroyed things because it was just it was evidence of a connection, I guess, to something that had meaning. Again, I am a sentimentalist. I am very empathetic by nature. So it's very hard for me to really enjoy seeing something get destroyed, particularly if it's important to somebody else. That really sets me off. And to watch this go on for just days and days on end, fires, killings, I mean, real killings, rapes, violations of all sorts. I grew up, and I still do, hate firearms. You know, I hate them. There are a few people on the planet that hate them more. But I will say this. I mean, even though I was exposed to them in a bad way, in terms of being in a position where I was worried I was going to get shot, having it so close to home with respect to my mother hearing it for the first time, I will say this. I was very, very, very glad that the owners of Corvo's Bakery in Cleveland had those guns and told, even so, I mean, they still, these kids that had been programmed, this is, Antifa and Black Lives Matter are cults. There's just no other way to put it. They are cults. These kids, largely kids, not all kids, mind you, but these kids are programmed. The university system has a lot to do with it because they're not really, the emotional intelligence quotient is just completely out of the picture, and that is the number one consideration with respect to our society even surviving in the first place. I'm going to get to that in a few minutes.
Yeah, well, we do have to go to our first music break. I was going to say,
yeah, we've been at this for a while.
But as far as Antifa goes, yeah, anybody out there, if you have questions on Periscope or in our Spreaker.com chat room, make sure you put them in caps. But as far as Antifa go, I've been watching so many different videos and stuff, and they are focusing on the younger generations because they're so pliable and easy to manipulate and such. And it's just scary what situations they're throwing these kids into and how naive these kids are about it.
Yep. And unfortunately, it's a situation where they have far, far more control than they are emotionally capable of handling. They do not have the perspective. And, I mean, it is more about these times than, I mean, the kids of our time, or my time more accurately, would have been far more emotionally mature. Even then, not completely formed, but compared to what's going on today, they may be very well informed cognitively, but they're not emotionally, and that is a big, big, big problem. At any rate, I do know you were saying, are we going to break yet, or you just were breaking in to let people know they could go ahead and ask questions?
Well, we are going to go to our first musical break, and we have Gravity from Krakow, Poland with Throw You Away. And then we have Mr. Fred Johnson III from Kenyon County, California with After Dark, as well as Gravity again with Take a Walk in My Shoes. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back right after this musical break.
to a college scene. I like to go and dance, have drinks, and hunt the perfect date. Yeah. Living at the dark, I search lonely streets to find hidden shadows in the dark. It doesn't matter what I say. Secret homicides arranged in a series of pursuits. No matter what I say, after dark, I gave her face because she had the range. I knew she was the one that never could go home again. Plastic life by limo seats. I don't know why I can't control this urge to hurt again. Yeah. Living at the dark, I search lonely streets to find hidden shadows in the dark. It doesn't matter what I say. Changes in the sky, murder forever after. No matter what I say, after dark. Feeling ran to arguments and fear. In hiding place with days of December. Concerning works were meshed in the bandage. It doesn't matter what I say. It really doesn't. No matter what I say, after dark. It doesn't matter what I say. Secret homicides arranged in a series of pursuits. No matter what I say, change in the sky, murder forever after. It doesn't matter what I say. Rude and fatal, lacking the hint of conscience. No matter what I say, after dark.
So walk down the street, thinking all the things you said you need. Why don't you tell me, baby, how do you feel? So walk down the street, thinking all the things you said you need. Why don't you tell me, baby, how do you feel? Don't you take a walk? Why don't you take a walk? In my shoes, why don't you take a walk? Before you tell me what to do, why don't you take a walk? Why don't you take a walk? In my shoes, why don't you take a walk? Before you tell me what to do. No, it's easy, you tell me what to do. Have you ever stopped to think all the things that I've been through? No, it's easy, you tell me what to do. Have you ever stopped to think all the things that I've been through? Don't you take a walk? Don't you take a walk? In my shoes, don't you, baby, take a walk? Before you tell me what to do. Don't you take a walk? Don't you take a walk? In my shoes, don't you, baby, take a walk? Before you tell me what to do. Why don't you
Welcome back, and thanks so much for joining us tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. So tonight we have Mr. Jim Moses. Jim, welcome back, and thanks for hanging out with us tonight.
Of course, Tessa. Definitely a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity, as I said previously. But yes, I understand that someone has a question, and I definitely want to talk about that because I've touched upon it to an extent. So by all means, definitely tell me more.
Okay, so Robert was saying, just referring to the people, and I use that term loosely, that are destroying historical monuments and history. Can we label them in the same allotment as ISIS?
Yes, Robert, to an extent. The one difference is that with ISIS, there is a very pronounced effort to be able to erase history because they want to more or less pretend it never happened. There is an element of that with this group, but I don't think they have the level of insight to be able to understand how much they're not serving the purpose they intend. In a situation where you're dealing with a radical group in another country where there is systemic violence, which I think is not the case in the United States. We have a lot of violence, do not get me wrong, but it's worth noting now that only 10 African Americans were killed unarmed last year, which is too many, 10 too many. Let me be very clear about that. But out of a population, an estimated 44 million, as was quoted by an online commentator, definitely a major African American, and I can't remember exactly who it was. The difference being basically is that there is an expectation of themselves as much as anyone else to do certain things as a demonstration of outrage. Okay, so what does that look like under normal circumstances? Protesting. And there was no problem with the protesting. Although, that said, we haven't really gotten into the underlying circumstances with respect to George Floyd. We have not talked about the possibility, based on what's already happened in the last year, or 6 months anyways, as far as the, again, pandemic goes, what I've heard, and again, I haven't been able to corroborate, but I think these sources are fairly reliable. There is a lawyer in Dallas who has said it is his belief that George Floyd died 3 years ago, which goes into the possibility of doubles and body doubles, which has been talked about before. Not going to get into the cloning thing. That's a little too far out there for me. I'm aware of it. Let's put it that way. But there is some evidence, and I think that we have not talked, there's not been enough talk in the press that the differences, the distinct differences in the person identified as Officer Derek Chauvin are just, there's something very wrong. They're not the same person, although they're close. You can see definitely the resemblance, but there are very specific differences that are not easily addressed, that cannot be explained away. That is a problem for me, and also the associations raise some questions too. The tight-knitness of a group that supposedly were rookies training, when one of them definitely was involved with Chauvin's, I forget what the connection is. The bottom line, this should not have been the case if they were so new. And if they're that new, then, of course, there is, in my estimation, a lot of people want to hang all four of them out to dry. I don't know that they necessarily understand police culture that completely, and I don't know how, it would depend largely on what that looks like around Minneapolis.
Well, I mean, I don't think that anybody's above the law. And if I were out with a group of my friends and one of my friends had this, past history with this guy and really did not like him, and he decided to kick his ass and in turn killed him, we'd all be convicted for just standing there and not doing anything.
Well, here's the problem. You're talking about a group of friends, and you're absolutely right. That is effectively accessory to homicide, probably third-degree manslaughter. You would end up being at least charged. I would suspect that it would have to be extenuating circumstances in order to be sent to prison as a result of that. However, when you're dealing with police, the training officer wields a lot of authority. Now, does that mean that someone should not step up and say something? Absolutely not. But I am going to say that I think that there is a problem in terms of the inability and the isolation that occurs when you're dealing with a training situation. That's a big part of it. But again, there are major question marks that are associated with this that need to be answered. There are problems, and I think it is very telling. I don't think that people have talked about this almost at all, and we're going to, well, now's a good time as any, and we're going to touch on a few different things winding down, but I don't know how many people here are aware of this. I only found out about it, and I was inclined to basically give George Zimmerman the benefit of the doubt because I thought there were certain aspects to the Trayvon Martin killing that did not add up. I didn't know the specifics. The lawyer for his mother, primarily his mother and father, Tracy, who is a ex-thug his mother, who is now actually running for office and is in the news again. Surprising. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the bottom line is they more or less portrayed George Zimmerman as a thug, as, you know, having a hatred for African Americans, which could not have been further for the truth, because he was mentoring kids that were African American. This is all in a production by a rather sleazy gentleman by the name of Jules Gilbert called the Trayvon Hoax. And the lawyer, Benjamin Crump, basically ended up completely obstructing George Zimmerman's right to a fair trial and, by extension, justice. He should have been disbarred the minute it was discovered. He ended up presenting a witness that was not the person in question that Trayvon knew, and had been the source of extreme irritation, which is why he started pounding on George Zimmerman, because he was afraid that George was going to snitch on him, and that was the culture. He was used to that culture in school. It's Benjamin Crump who's representing George Floyd's family. That, to me, is a huge red flag. It really, really does call into question the legitimacy of the circumstances. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear. I do not for 1 minute believe that George Floyd deserved to die. He is not a martyr. He was not someone that was especially responsible. He committed some crimes that were very, very, I don't want to use the word heinous, but certainly disgusting. And had the person in question, a pregnant woman that he was holding at gunpoint, had she had a miscarriage, he might be in prison. He would have been in prison rather than in a position where Derek Chauvin was suffocating him. The issue more than anything else is we're not representing the truth. Yes, we need to be cognizant. We need to be aware of instances where there's racism, abuse. And by the way, getting into the reclaiming of words, the true definition, racism can be described as two different things. One, either oppression of a people or of people because of their race, as the name would connote, that in other words, that they're discriminated against because of their race, or the tendency to assume, extrapolate, conclude that just because somebody is a particular race, then they must be, something about them must be true. The most classic example is that because someone is African American and black, they must be good at basketball, which is kind of amusing in a way, but at the same time you can see the point, especially if you hate basketball. By the same token, it's racist on anybody's part, white or black, to assume, that's just because somebody's African American, they're going to like rap or jazz or anything. That's what racism is. It is an assumption. That's really what the word is that describes it best. Even in the instance where there is discrimination, it's an assumption that someone is not going to be capable of doing something, or that someone will end up being a liability as a result of, particularly in the case of employment. It is a blanket or stereotypical assumption about a particular race. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. There is nothing that construes as racist if you don't happen to like a particular aspect of a race's culture. You know what I'm saying? That's really what it comes down to. And you can be critical, but it's when you start to be critical of people, there's a statement basically that they're not capable of being contributing members, I guess contributing members of society would be a good way of putting it. Again, this comes back to the class issue. This comes back to the economic considerations more than anything else. That's really what drives it. And the expectations involved with being able to change one's economic station, which have no bearing in reality any longer, if they ever really did, bringing us back full circle to the whole notion with respect to degrees. To give you an idea of what it was like when I was when I was growing up, in the early 70s, it wasn't a bad idea to get an associate's degree. It was a way of getting specific training after high school, being far better prepared in order to be able to transition into a job or a career or an occupation. By the mid-'80s, I would say, maybe late 80s, associate's degrees became required for a lot of jobs. Not all jobs, but a lot of jobs. And bachelor's degrees weren't a good idea in the minds of some people in terms of improving your possibilities of being employed, which was just not a good idea all around, because you had the need to be able to fill positions. You needed to have more people contributing to the public tax base in order to be able to continue providing goods and services, particularly during recessions. By the early to mid-'90s, you start to see a situation where there is a growing expectation that people have bachelor's degrees. It wasn't too prevalent, but it was starting to become more so. And that was where it really started to get ugly, in my estimation. That's when you saw there was no sane reason attached to this need, except the perception, especially with African Americans, that they were not going to be competent enough in order to perform in a particular position effectively, even though it may not have any bearing on the education expected. Even a liberal arts degree, this was the rationale, and a lot of it was feeding a culture, a university culture, which felt they were entitled to continue having perpetual validation. Again, getting into the externalization of societal value, which is the third biggest problem and challenge with respect to society surviving. But I digress. By the middle to the end of the 90s into the 2000s, it became a situation, as I said, the bachelor degree was a requirement for a lot of jobs, and then the master's degree was what was recommended in order to be able to enhance your chances of being able to get, quote-unquote, better, not just better paying, but better work. Again, not rooted necessarily in the economic reality, because a lot of the jobs really didn't require master's degrees. It was narcissism, institutional narcissism, that is now absolutely feeding what's going on with the riots and the looting, which is counterintuitive as hell. But again, a lot of this is, we know the title that I chose was Making Sense Out of the Senseless. It's difficult. There's a lot of challenges, I think, for people who are sane thinking, reasonable people, to be able to reconcile what has just happened to their lives as much as anybody else, if not directly impacting them, certainly indirectly. We have a situation where, because of the externalization of societal value that has a direct bearing on how African Americans, as much as any race, is viewed, there is no sense. People are being manipulated to such an extent. A lot of the kids that have been involved with these activities are cut off from themselves. They don't know who they are. They've been so desensitized by the expectation, the externalization, again, and I want to get into the details of that, because there's a lot of people that would take offense. But the reasons why people make decisions with respect to their appearance, with respect to what they're doing for activities, peer pressure has become far, far more pervasive than it was, I think, in terms of influencing people over the age of 18 now than it ever was in my lifetime. And you're seeing it. You're seeing it. Again, the big question for me throughout all of this is, where are the goddamn adults? Where are the people that have enough insight to be able to say, or enough courage of their convictions to say, this is not right. This is not going to help you. You should not be doing this. It has no bearing. But most of all, this is where it really gets, this is where I draw the line. I am not kneeling for anybody, nor should any race kneel for anybody. It's inexcusable. If they want to, fine. But the expectation of someone kneeling? No. This is a violation beyond words. And it is so counterintuitive to what they really want or ostensibly want. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of the African Americans would be the first to say to these white kids, get up, fool. I don't want you kneeling for me. I don't want that one bit. Get lost. Get out of my neighborhood, or expect to get shot. And I mean, I hate to put it in those terms. I am not advocating that there be killings under any circumstances. But there's no common sense. They think they're going to go into a neighborhood with gang members and they're going to just go ahead and dictate to them how they're supposed to behave? No. These people won't stand for that for 5 seconds, and they didn't. I mean, the fact that those kids that went into the neighborhood in Los Angeles lived is remarkable. With what we know, the Crips basically said, "Get out of here, or you're going to be dead." That's the essence of what they were communicating to them, which is understandable. Other communities, like, as I said, the situation with Corvo's Bakery in Cleveland, where the family members basically formed a line. There was a Target in Philadelphia, down, I think, around Center City, where African Americans and Caucasians stood and basically said, get lost. You go near the store, you're going to get hurt. This is what we have to do, and we shouldn't. There's the fact that we have to do this, and the fact that the mainstream media has been fueling this, that the politicians, and not just the Democrats, mostly the Democrats, but several Republicans have rolled over. They've capitulated. They have not said, no, we're not this is not acceptable. We will not tolerate this, and you should know that. If you don't, there's a problem. You need to start looking very deeply. The problem is you have an entire party who does not know how to take responsibility. It's everybody's fault but theirs. You know, oh, it's the Russians. Oh, it's Trump. It's this. It's that. They're their own worst enemy. And these kids are a reflection of that party for the most part. They're their own worst enemy. I am appalled because there are reports of a black kid getting hung. And I sit there and I say to myself, what the hell did you expect? Not at all justifying or condoning what happened to this poor soul, because he certainly didn't deserve it. Nobody deserves to die, but at some point, somebody has to say something. They have to defend themselves. As much as I hate firearms, like I had noted earlier, I'm not standing for it. I'm not going to be told what to do. What they did there was a woman, and I don't know whether you saw this, Tessa. There was a white woman, I don't remember which city it was, who was basically told in a very blithe tone by the Antifa/Black Lives Matter representative or agent or whatever you want to call it, well, my CEO's watching, so you need to kneel or else there's going to be problems. And this woman kneeled. And I'm sitting there thinking, where are the Me Too clique? Why are they not screaming at the top of their lungs? Is this not abuse? Is this not harassment? Or is it just fine to go ahead and scream fire, the equivalent of fire, and ruin someone's life? Of course, we know that people like Benjamin Crump almost did it to George Zimmerman, who was just absolutely torn apart by killing Trayvon. Trayvon knew that it was his fault. He went after George's gun.
That's where, like, I've had this question, and I wrote it down. How was it at all Trayvon's fault? This guy, Zimmerman, had past history. He even tried to be a cop. They did not accept him because he was mentally unstable. He was doing the neighborhood watch thing, and he was going way overboard with it several times. He saw Trayvon Martin walking, decided to follow him, and he said he had a gun. He had a bag of Skittles. This teenage boy that went to the store, got a bag of Skittles, and was heading back home, and on the phone with one of his friends, got shot because this guy thought he had a gun, and he's black. Like, I don't know.
Well, I can tell you.
Go ahead.
I can tell you what really happened if you want, and I do believe I know
follow,
enough.
Like,
again,
Court
my
TV and all
sound.
kinds of different things. You know, I don't just follow one news thing because I know how a lot of them are owned. So I like to look at different variations and world news, even when it comes to this pandemic, aka COVID virus or whatnot. But I mean, I watched this case through and through. I saw from the beginning all the different things coming through, and I don't know. I never saw where Trayvon Martin turned around and beat his ass. This is a teenage boy being stalked by an older, heavyset guy. You know, he's not very tall, but he is, you know...
So the height difference is what basically put... Number one, the visibility was a big issue. You were dealing with rain. You were dealing with a situation where George was trying to be as diplomatic as possible. The only reason he got out, if you watch the documentary, and I believe this, it makes complete sense to me. And there was an eyewitness who saw the attack by Trayvon. It was not George that attacked Trayvon. It was Trayvon that attacked George. And remember, Trayvon has like 7 inches on him. Yeah, George is stout. Yeah, he's got weight to him. But Trayvon was beaten down on him, and he just attacked him. And the reason why, as I said, part of it was he was upset as to what the outcome with respect to Diamond Eugene. The real Diamond Eugene, and again, if you watch the documentary, you'll know more about that. But what happened, what was actually going on was that the reason Trayvon had, as I understand it, not just Skittles, but also some sort of either iced tea or soft drink. Those are the ingredients for something called lean. Yep. That was his, he was getting ready. He was going over to his stepfather's, but he was getting ready to be cranked. There's no other word to use. Juiced. That's the term, juiced. And that lean, the ingredients of lean, because of the sugar factor, are Skittles, some sort of soft drink, and Robitussin, because the codeine is what ends up being the psychoactive agent.
And the soft drink, because of the carbonation, it makes it go into your system faster, but Snapple does not have carbonation in it. It's just
no, but it doesn't need to be carbonation per se. But yes, the carbonation definitely is something that expedites the process. But it's known that iced tea and, yes, Snapple absolutely do go into lean. It's a way of cutting the taste of the Robitussin, as you can imagine. I'm not saying, my belief is that he did not intentionally kill him, and I still do not believe. I think from the looks of it, there's no doubt in my mind that George's life was in danger. There's no other way to put it. The way that he describes it, his head was getting banged. Trayvon was banging George's head on the concrete. I mean, repeatedly banging his head on the concrete.
How many times had he stalked Trayvon through the neighborhood? Because he
only once. What happened was basically there had been break-ins. There had been a number of different break-ins in the community. So he was told by the 911 operator, I think it's a private or some sort of security group. I don't remember the exact details.
They told him not to approach him. Do not approach him.
Well, no. The reason he got out was he didn't know what direction he was going in. He was not approaching him. Trayvon came out and attacked George, not George.
Okay, so George was in his own neighborhood, but he didn't know which way he was going.
He couldn't tell because there are a lot of places at Snakes. There are like 6 or 7 different sidewalks because you've got subdivisions. The way it's divided, I saw the map. There's no doubt about it. You can't know in the darkness. The darkness is a big part of it. If it had been during the day, obviously there had been some way of being able to tell where he went. But because he could have gone between the houses, there's no way to know where he went. There's rows and rows of different units going down the path. You've got the single sidewalk, and then you've got the sidewalks crossing over. So there's no way for him. There was no way, him in the car, there was no way for him to be able to tell where Trayvon had gone from there because of the visibility. The visibility was not good. It was raining, and he knew that Trayvon had a hood, but he had nothing more he could go on. And because had been those break-ins, because there had been definitely break-ins previously, home invasions, things that were, there needs to be security against, people losing property and so forth. All George wanted to do was to be able to determine what direction Trayvon went in so he could tell the people that he was reporting back to. He did not approach Trayvon. Trayvon came out at him. That's been confirmed. And what Trayvon
he had
said
been following
at the very
Trayvon
end,
for quite some time, and that was
no, he hadn't. That is where the testimony is wrong, and the phone records prove it. That is where it falls apart. That was absolutely incorrect. He had not been following him for very long at all. You know, in other words, it was a situation because they asked a question, what direction did he go? And he said, I'm not sure. I can try to find out. But he did not stalk Trayvon. This is completely, absolutely, this was an invention on the part of Benjamin Crump and Trayvon's mother. It's all been talked about. But what I was going to say is this. This is the most important thing to keep in mind. What Trayvon said at the very end, and there's no way George could have known this, was, first of all, Trayvon took George's gun. George had forgotten completely he even had the gun. So that right there, Trayvon took the gun when he felt the gun. And then at that point, George had no choice but to try to fight back and shot him because he didn't want to get shot by Trayvon. He didn't have faith. The way that Trayvon had behaved previously, banging his head against this concrete, and George was trying to leverage himself so he wasn't directly, his head was not directly making contact with the concrete.
He had barely even any abrasions on him.
He had serious injury.
Yeah, he had it all wrapped up, and they took it off, and they took pictures of it. It was like, it had my kid falling down and scraped its head.
No. The photos are very clear to me. There's no doubt. His nose was almost broken. It was banged up very badly, and he had very serious abrasions on his head. Those were serious abrasions in my estimation. That was not just a little scrape. That was repeated impacts. He's lucky he didn't end up with a concussion. I'm surprised he didn't. I'm sure they ended up holding him for observation. But let me get to this for a second. And again, I really do believe the fact that they fabricated the witness is enough evidence that they knew they didn't have enough ground to stand on. And, of course, the fact that the witness that did see what happened, the fight, there's just no question about it. But what Trayvon said to George when he realized, he basically said after George shot him, because, again, George feared for his life, with good reason, he said, "You got me." Kind of almost half amusingly. And then he said as he was dying, "Tell Mom Alicia I'm sorry." And that was his grandmother. So Trayvon knew he'd done wrong. He knew he was in the wrong. There was no doubt about it. And there's no way George would have known who Mom Alicia was. You couldn't have fabricated that. No way. In my estimation, this was, they tried railroad. I'm not saying that George is the greatest human being on earth, but I know that he did not deliberately kill Trayvon. He killed him in self-defense. And it's a tragedy. And Trayvon is a victim. The problem is that because of the reaction by people who should have had the emotional intelligence, the intellectual curiosity to get the truth, to find out the truth, rather than exploiting it, because of that, we have, in no small part, devastation, and just almost incomparable to anything that's occurred since the Civil War. It really, there's no other way to put it. It's hard to put it any other way, you know, and this is why intellectual dishonesty kills people. It foments destruction. It's wrong, and we're dealing with it more than ever at any time, again, particularly the Democratic Party. There is just a failure to really have any desire to arrive at the truth. If it's a situation where it serves their ends, they will do whatever is necessary, and this is why we have the rioting. This is why we have the looting. This is the problem. Nobody is telling the truth, you know, at times when it's most critical. And
well, they're trying to separate us and have us fighting each other instead of fighting them.
Absolutely, because they're basically trying to create a situation where we are incapable of responding to as what I've characterized as mortal threats, and they are. They threaten our entire species, all life on Earth.
Yeah, and I've seen video of where, you know, everybody's gathering for their peaceful protests, and there's buildings with weird lighting, and the doors open, and there's a stack of bricks right by the entrance of the store. Like, this is a total setup.
And the problem is we know who ended up providing the bricks, and it's a source of serious irritation to me because he's not somebody that's talked about as being part of this globalist initiative. And he absolutely has to have ties to Soros for sure. And that's Warren Buffett, who from Berkshire Hathaway, because the company in Texas that provided the bricks, Acme Brick, I mean, you don't get more generic than that. So, I mean, again,
Come on,
it's pretty
Wiley.
obvious.
Where you at with your
Absolutely.
Acme rocket and such?
It just stops just short of being a Roadrunner joke under the circumstances, Looney Tunes. But my point is this, Tessa, is that there is not. We are putting far too much faith in people who are not deserving of it, and the ones that do need to have more faith invested in them are going spiritually hungry as a result. There's no ability to believe. I mean, I've certainly experienced it. People are too damn eager to believe the worst about anybody. They'll turn on you on a dime, some of them. And it's frustrating because you want to be able to believe that you can trust these people. And so to a certain extent, I do understand I can empathize somewhat with the reaction, but not to the extent. The problem is nobody stepped in and said, no, you can't do this. We know you're pissed off. We know you're upset, but this is not acceptable. No, they just let it happen. They just let them run rampant. The police departments, the politicians, just let them take over. There's no way to rationalize it. And as I said to you during the break, I can't reconcile the fact that there are people I know that have an expectation of me to agree with this. I don't. I never will. And it is not a commentary on me being a racist. I am not a Republican, but, again, we're going to talk more about these words that have been hijacked by various factions in a minute. I'm not patriotic. I don't like the word patriot because it is very male-centric, which I don't know that a lot of people are even aware of. The equivalent, if it did exist, would be matriot. I much prefer for those of us that are concerned with people having freedom to be called stewards of freedom. We have no stewardship. So that seems to me the obvious thing to be calling ourselves because we want there to be stewards. We want people to be overseeing things that there's not the level of abuse which is occurring across the board. And you're dealing with a situation where there are no adults in the room. That's what's so terrifying for me, that people who have been elected to office in order to safeguard our rights, to safeguard our lives, are just basically disavowing themselves of that obligation. There's just no other word to use. If I was somebody who had a family member, or God forbid, I was shot, I would tear these people to pieces. I would sue them. I would sue these politicians because they have contributed to this climate. There is no denying it. You listen to them, and it is very clear that they have no interest in the truth. Most of them, not all of them. But I mean, people like Keith Ellison, who was supposed to be at one point a vice presidential candidate, the assistant general in Minnesota, the woman who should have made sure that Derek Chauvin, again, however much he actually exists, never should have worn a police uniform again, worn a badge. Amy Klobuchar, another potential vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, abdication of responsibility. It's a litany. The mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, stands up a month and a half ago, criticizes people for going out without masks, criticizes them for not wanting to be locked down anymore, and then goes out to get her hair done because she has to. She has an image to uphold. This is the lunacy we're dealing with, the double standards, the hypocrites, the hypocrisy, and the intellectual dishonesty, which, again, as I say, has now killed and injured and created just heartbreak of an unprecedented scale because these people just don't care. They really don't care at the end of the day, unless if their agenda is met, serviced. That's all that matters to them, really. I can't come to any other conclusion based on the reactions that I've seen. getting to what I was going to talk about with respect to moving forward, if there is a way of moving forward, where do we go from here? How do we move forward when there is such an unrealistic expectation, tacit perhaps, but so many people, I don't know enough to be able to trust their judgment because of the responses that I've seen across the board. Number one, the problem lies, and I've said this in other conversations with you in these programs, our economic model must change so that more people are capable of having control over their own lives. The hierarchical structures have to go. That really is what is at the core of what I call conscientious anarchy. You have conscientious anarchy where it's about seeking ways of creating interfaces, platforms for people to be able to benefit on a collaborative basis, where their gifts, their strengths, their talents are utilized in a way that everybody benefits. Everybody benefits simultaneously. There is nobody that has greater value. They may end up assuming greater responsibility, but that does not mean someone who has less responsibility is of lesser value. And unfortunately, the prevailing business model that's never been more the case. So that has to go. That is something that really, I think, is reflective of why you have the level of chaos and absolute mayhem that has occurred with these looters and rioters, and now the independent country of Chaz in Seattle.
Well, it's just ridiculous because, there's a peaceful protest. There's a way to get your thoughts and your words and, what you want to get across out there. But destroying and all this other stuff, this conveys the wrong message. This is just causing anger and frustration. And if you did actually have a message, it's muting it. This is not the way to go about it. In Alamosa, Colorado, we had a single father who was just trying to drive through an intersection. And this peaceful protest was very small, and there was a line of people that were in the middle of the road, and of course they parted ways, and just as soon as he was starting to drive through, he was actually an attorney, what do they call him, that provides services for people that go to jail, public pretender. So he was the public defender.
Public defender, that's right, yeah. Yes.
And he shot this guy through his passenger window, which shot him in the head, and he sat there for a moment, and then he proceeded to drive forward, and they found him about 3/4 of a mile away or whatnot. But, he's in critical condition. He hasn't been killed, but there's been other people shot during these protests, which is downright ridiculous.
It's awful. It's awful. It's appalling, and there's no justifying it. There is no justifying it, and the failure to decry this on the part of people, to decry, here's the other part of the problem, Tessa, and I'm going to return to what I'm talking about with respect to the economic model, some of the things we've talked about previously, but here's the problem. So much of this agenda is being driven by the Democrats, so they really can't talk about, they can't really protest what's going on because it exposes them. It creates a conflict, or if they do, then you have a situation where people start to ask more questions. All right, well, so if you feel that way, why did you allow it to happen? This is where the real insidious aspect, in my estimation at this moment in time, the Democratic Party is beyond redemption. I hate saying that, and there needs to be some other party that really understands what progressivism looks like, because the Democrats definitely have no clue. It's one extreme or the other. There's nobody that is capable of really responding in a way that is going to create a feeling of relief and resolution. But therein lies the problem. You're dealing with people. Soros is funding a lot of these campaigns, a lot of these politicians' campaigns, underwriting them a lot of them. They're in bed with Bill Gates, a fair number. Something that I want to point out in particular, a African-American Democratic Congressman, Bobby Rush from Illinois, apparently negotiated last August. It is fairly reliable, from a fairly reliable source, negotiated last August. I tagged you in this, so there may be people who saw it on your wall. $100 billion contact tracing contract with the Gates Foundation. That was the month that the first case showed up in Wuhan. Now, whether or not that was time for that reason is hard to say. My point is that the Democrats are very, very much in bed with the Gates Foundation, with the people that drove this pandemic, goosed these riots. There is no doubt in my mind any longer, and this is where the conflict becomes very clear, where they're just basically they're dead. We've got them dead to rights. Now the Republicans are not perfect by any means, and I am not a I'm not a Republican supporter per se. But I will say this much: I think that there is at least an understanding of what needs to happen regardless. I mean, defunding the police is not an answer. There needs to be certainly great improvements, not just with the police department, but almost every institution, every segment of society. The relationships have deteriorated
even the
a
freaking House
lot.
and Senate. Geez, how old are these people? Like, half of them are falling asleep during all this stuff. But I mean, there should be
Biden,
just
Biden
like with the
certainly
president.
being one of them.
Yeah, just like with the president, there should be a cutoff. This person should not be able to sit there for their whole entire life. There should be a cutoff for people in the House and Senate because they get comfortable, because they have a very good pay. And during a lot of these supplemental payments that we've supposedly been getting, we got the first one. A lot of us haven't. But they're sitting on it, and at the same time, they're trying to pass at the same time that they get paid
You're
more
right.
for what they're doing. It's like,
You're
are
right.
you serious? Also, abortion was in there too, another Democratic thing. But it's like, don't judge every one of the Democrats for a few bad apples. It's just like that in every freaking party. And I think, like you were saying earlier, there's powers behind this that are playing puppet master, not only unto the president, but the House, the Senate. There's a game going on that a lot of us aren't aware of.
I agree to an extent, but here's the problem. Here's where you're dealing with the systemic issue with the Democratic Party, and I think there are a few. I think that they're the exceptions rather than the rule now in the Democratic Party, as far as I'm concerned. I think there are far fewer people of integrity in that party now than there aren't, and I don't know how you end up giving the people that do really care and want to do something of substance rather than just lip service, the ability, the power to be able to supersede the DNC and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Adam Schiff. These people are corrupted. And part of it, you're right, is the amount of time they've been in there. The other problem is that there's far too much power held by lobbyists. The lobbyists are a huge issue, and also Citizens United, of course, too,
Well, the
because of the fact now the
Electoral College,
corporations.
too. It's like, why
See,
even
I don't
vote?
agree with that because to me, the Electoral College is a safeguard against there being if you have a situation where the greatest amount of population is on the coasts, the Electoral College allows those in the middle, literally in the middle, to have some effect on the outcome. Eliminate the Electoral College and it's a problem. That's why it was instituted, because there was an observation long ago because of the demographics, not the demographics, the topological aspect of the United States, and then by extension, perhaps the demographics. You needed some way to prevent the coast, the greatest concentration of population, to determine in every instance the outcome of elections. That's why the Electoral College exists.
Yeah, back in the day, that was substantial, but today, we the people, not we the Electoral College, that we went to college so we know better than everybody else. There's a certain degree of that makes sense, but at the same time, why even vote? Why not just let the Electoral College do it instead of having millions of people go out to vote? Why not just have this select few do it?
Well, the problem, first of all, I don't know if you're aware of this. The Electoral College is a euphemism. What the Electoral College is the number of votes assigned. There's a specific number of votes assigned to each state based on population. And the Electoral College allows for the states in the middle of the country, the ones that are less populated, to have some influence on the outcome of the election based on the count. It's not based just on the popular vote. Because the problem is, especially with two parties, you create a situation. This is why ranked choice voting becomes critical, in as much that it ends up encouraging the emergence of new parties, new voices, new perspectives, which we have never needed more than now. I think that, from what I said previously, that should be obvious. The Electoral College is a hedge against the possibility of concentrated populations who have very specific interests dominating or being the sole determinant. And it also actually goes back, I think, to a certain extent to the Civil War, because there was a problem in terms of the North being far more economically dominant than the South, which, again, is a conversation that's controversial. A lot of people don't want to accept the validity of it. Slaves are part of the equation because they did absolutely support the South's economy, which was already dominated to a great extent by the North, because the South really did not have a diversified economy by any means. There were two primary crops, tobacco and cotton, and that's why slavery became such an issue to the South, because if they lost the slaves, then there would be no way for them to be able to transition easily, and the North did not really. There has always been this rivalry between the North and the South, some of which I don't entirely understand myself, before the Civil War, not related just to slaves, but in terms of attitudes. And I do think it possibly has something to do with places in England, places in Ireland. I'm not really sure, but the bottom line is that rivalry was translating largely to the way that the economies interacted. There was friction, let's put it that way, and that did absolutely contribute to the Civil War. There's no question about it. As much as people may not want to believe it, it's true. The slaves certainly were an issue. There's no doubt about it. I know that. It's very clear to me, but also I think that the percentage or the pervasiveness of slavery had declined by the Civil War. That's something a lot of people don't realize, was that you had far less slaves in the South by the time of the Civil War. There'd been a fair number that had been freed. But that's neither here nor there. The point I'm making is, in a situation where the possibility of the interests of many states, Colorado included, I might throw that in, certainly in the past before Denver became a major population center, or the metropolitan Denver area, including Boulder, Aurora, Lakewood, so forth and so on, you needed a way that the people who wanted to be represented could have some influence on the outcome of the election. And when there were more parties, although there wasn't a lot of instances where you had multiple parties beyond two, the Democrats and then the Republicans, who of course came along in 1860 in the wake of, preceding the Civil War, because abolition was their primary plank, you could do things where there was the opportunity to really have a diversity, a real choice involved. You don't have that choice anymore. You don't have it. It's just not available. The game is rigged so completely, particularly by the Democrats. The Republicans, I don't think, rigged their elections quite to the same extent. The Democratic National Committee has now basically hijacked the nomination process 2 elections in a row. And it's not a huge surprise to me, because of the fact that there's a very specific agenda that they are pushing. And it is not something that is well received by a large percentage of not just conservatives, but progressives as well. As you saw, again, I'm not a Sanders supporter, but I also understand why people were taken in by him. A lot of what he's saying appears to be good, but the problem is the overreach, the inability to acknowledge the economic realities and respond in a way that provides the resources, the technological resources, especially for people to transition into that economy far more gracefully, as opposed to a very jarring transition, such as Alexander Ocasio-Cortez wants to bring about. All I'm saying is respect with the Electoral College. It's a way of making sure that everybody's vote has meaning. You know what I'm saying? Because if you have a situation where there are large population states, they are going to be the ones that dominate in a popular vote. It's just the way it goes. And frequently, it is based on very specific constituent politics. And that's where the polarization occurs. There doesn't need to be the same measure of polarization when there's more full representation, which is the idea behind fusion, whereby if you had multiple parties.
Colorado, and we all voted a certain way last year. most of us voted a certain way. I didn't, vote for Trump or Hillary, but the Electoral College went the opposite direction of the positive poll, the one that had the most votes. So they're not really speaking for the people. They're making their own freaking decision, as far as I'm concerned.
No,
and I've seen it repeatedly.
See, this is the thing that I have to be able to clarify. I understand why you're saying that, but the problem is that you're not. When people completely want to eliminate the Electoral College, they're not looking at the votes. They're not looking at the distribution of the votes in those states. And at one time, Colorado was a state that definitely did not have much of a voice in Congress because it was, it was in development. You know what I'm saying? It was not fully formed yet. Until Denver became a major economic powerhouse, Colorado was looked as a frontier state. And when the Electoral College was set up, it was largely to make sure that people in those states that didn't have a large population base yet were heard. That their vote had meaning. And I mean, again, what you're describing with respect to the independents is another story entirely.
There was not enough people, but now we have plenty of people.
They're still not. Comparatively speaking, the
to the East Coast, of course, like
concentrated.
nobody's going to have the same concentration as the East Coast because that's been most populated for all these years because that's where everybody arrived, for the most part.
It's also the West Coast. It's the West Coast and the East Coast alike. You're talking on the order of something along the lines. Both coasts, I believe, are like 100 million people each. So you've got basically 100 million. Then you've got an area close to, I don't know what the square mileage is, but certainly it's got to be, in width, it's got to be close to 2,500 miles at its widest point. You've got a population there of about 125 million. So I think it's 125 million is the difference, but I'm not sure. My point is that it's distributed over a far, far wider area than those two coasts. That's what I'm getting at. And because of that distribution, they're at a disadvantage. That's why the Electoral College, Electoral College is an equalizer, a way of countering. What's that?
Each state has their own Electoral College, and like you said, they have different points because of population. So one state might have more points than Colorado does, but we still, are voting as a people.
Not a lot more points, though. It's only, I believe the maximum is 2. Right, there's only 2 Electoral College votes that go with each state maximum, I believe. I'd have to double check exactly what it is, but I'm fairly certain there can be no more than 2. But what I'm saying is that you have a situation where if you're going strictly by the popular vote and you have 2 coasts that are going to be skewing left or Democrat without necessarily making any judgment about the left aesthetically speaking, it's this particular situation where there's the level of control over people's lives that it becomes a huge concern, where the Electoral College acts as a safeguard against abuse of power. I don't know how else to put it. It's not obvious. I'm not going to sit here and say it's perfect.
Yeah, I know what you're saying as far as like false
about
counts and such,
Exactly. This is what I'm saying. And again, I have serious concerns. I have been literally in the middle for a long time, really in the middle in terms of my philosophical position. But as it stands right now, I feel far more threatened. My well-being feels far more threatened by the Democrats outside of their propensity for providing money, which is not a little thing. I'm absolutely not looking the gift horse in the eye entirely. But in terms of protecting me from injury, I feel that although they certainly are not perfect, there are certainly some that within the party that I would not trust with my life. The Republicans are at this moment at least slightly better. And my position right now is that although I don't like him personally on some levels, I am willing to give Trump a chance to be able to reform things because there's already steps that have been taken that have never been done before.
Yeah, and when it comes to Trump, it's funny because he's always been Democratic until he decided to run, and then he was Republican, so that to me is funny. But, I mean, everybody deserves a chance, I agree. But yeah, I'm not Republican, and I'm not Democrat, and that's something I wanted to say earlier that I didn't get to say. I don't agree with a lot of shit that people are doing. But yeah, I didn't vote for Bernie Sanders, my sister really loves him, but I voted for Jill Stein, and my husband's like, well, you're basically just wasting your vote. No, that's my right to vote, and that's who I decided to vote for at that point.
Exactly.
I didn't want fucking Chump in there. I didn't want Hillary. I don't agree with either one of those people, but, you know, my husband is also Republican, and if there's a president, he's going to be there for him no matter what. And I don't know. I'm not a sheeple. It's hard for me to be a follower.
I hear you. And I will never be a blind follower under any circumstances. I am monitoring a lot of the disclosure culture. I think there are things happening which are certainly significant. The fact that this stuff was known, talking about Q, I think that a lot of what is being disclosed, in retrospect, is definitely evidence that there was knowledge of something very wicked going on in the background. It's my personal belief that there is the chance to be able to be free of a way of life that has not been good for most people for a very long time, where they do have the ability to really quickly do things with their life that they don't at this moment. This whole notion of earning is troubling to me. It always has been. Earning respect, earning a living. To me, if you want people to be responsible, you need to give them resources to do that. And if you keep making so many conditions, which is what I was starting to get at and I'm about to get more into, give people the resources, or at the very least, which is at the root of my particular universal basic income model, although if what has been reported is true, that Trump has indeed now taken the Federal Reserve under the banner of the U.S. Treasury, and that the Central Bank of London or the World Bank has no ability to derive any income from it any longer. That is something, when Kennedy attempted to do it himself, didn't go so well. One more reason, Vietnam was one.
Oh, yeah.
The attempt to go ahead and take on the Federal Reserve, or more accurately, the European bank cartel, contributed. There's no doubt in my mind that was part of it. There were a few different reasons why Kennedy got assassinated.
Yeah.
The Texas oil clique is another one, and that's where Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon and George Bush all come into play. But of course, Bush also because of the CIA.
And also
this was
sharing
the conversation.
Yeah, and also sharing
What's
UFO
that?
information, like UFO sightings with each other.
Yes,
between
with
us
Khrushchev
and this.
trying to end up arriving at détente. That was a big issue with, again, the military-industrial complex.
I think that was the straw.
It's possible. But it wasn't just the UFO. It was everything. Kennedy was actively trying to reach some sort of a peace treaty with Khrushchev, which was anathema at that moment to the hawks that were involved with the CIA, especially the CIA. Some of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, too, at the Pentagon were less than thrilled about it, but the CIA, it really stuck in their craw most. Another conversation, we may be able to touch on that for a few minutes, but I don't want to lose my train of thought.
Yeah.
The point being
can you
is
make a
that
note or finish your thought really quick, and then we'll go to break real fast.
All right, absolutely. What I was starting to say is, and I said this before, if you give people the ability to make choices, to contribute, to improve the quality of life for everyone on an expedient basis, rather than expect them to be sitting week in and week out working for someone else, not by choice, but because they have to support themselves, it's not in the end a very good economic model. It fails. Ultimately, it will fail. It's not something that can last indefinitely. I can talk more about that, but I know you want to go to break.
Definitely. Just something we got to do. But on this break, we have Mr. Roy Washington, and he's the creator of Quest Nation, and he has provided us with all of our music. So thank you so much, Mr. Roy Washington from Quest Nation. And his song is called Subliminal, and it has a lot to do with what's going on today. We also have Gravity from Krakow, Poland with My Last Goodbye, as well as Fred Johnson III from Canyon County, California. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back right after this musical break.
Yeah. Come on.
I see you, Roy Washington, man. What's happening, man?
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. They never say it in words, but in deeds wars declare. Justice is gone and the sight's none to spare. especially the kingdom encased in melanin. But these suckers are weak, kings and queens will ride again. Come on, slackers with badges, the white sheets and the maggots. Watch them fall as I tag them because I'm better than average. A sharpshooter with words with my eye to the scope. Can they escape when I've donned the black cape? Is hell no. I'm a ninja for right, who can vanish from sight. Pick you off in the night, but still the Lord is my light. Perceiving all you see, the truth behind the scenes. Instead of jumping bandwagons, the light says believe in me. Cause you're a puppet, no doubt. 45th turned you out. Though I saw your lips moving, no sound came out. So I was sent from the heavenlies, born so you could find me. Swam the scene and stream, took flight during the 90s. Landed in grace, wrote a verse of hip hop. Got with Jay and found the taste was smooth as butterscotch. We had hood love and money. Problems, they be on me, but we stayed in the flow. It had juice like Manolo.
They can try to oppress, you can try to impress. I'm just after success, none less. You can look in my eyes, you can feel in my vibes. Look me down inside and it's so subliminal. I got God on my side, I ain't worried about none. If it ain't about money, then it ain't about none. Laughing at my enemies, I know they see me coming. If it ain't subliminal, they can't even see me. Politics and violence shit, I'm here to raise the consciousness. For every face and race up in this nation trapped in poverty. Diamond in the rough, need to cut, shape it and polish it. Bad thoughts cripple life, we can be an optimist. We can be an optimist, reconstruct apocalypse. Broke people always hating, mix me with that gossiping. Rose up in the concrete, rain and sun, I'm blossoming. My people need to be like kind of Velcro, then we conquer it. They can try to oppress, you can try to impress. I'm just after success, none less. You can look in my eyes, you can feel in my vibes. King down inside and it's so subliminal. I got God on my side, I ain't worried about none. If it ain't about money, then it ain't about none. Laughing at my enemies, I know they see me coming. If it ain't subliminal, they can't even see me coming.
The 45th is a joke, and he's weak in disgust. He plans to divide, but there's no stopping us. If we have to fight, go toe to toe for our lives, we prevail and got sight, cause only light I recite. I blow my lyrics like a shotgun, camouflage inside the tracks. Now watch the suckers run. I'm moving fast enough, heads up, now here I come. I designed 50 ways to make this murder fun. I spit the lyrical rain that coat the concrete, that give life and take form. Arise and walk the street. Am I the greatest to spit? Feel the spray and we'll see. Let it dry, all the lies and the truth will point to me. Even when surrounded by a million MCs, I'm the one under the sun who's the greatest of these. I got the Holy Ghost juking and tapping while I'm rapping. Sticking and moving like Roy Jones, I'll make it happen. Even animals move when the novelist is rocking. My doggy started barking, his ears just a flopping. Subliminally, I penetrate camps like an enemy. Flicking the lights, cancel sight, cause you're not seeing me.
They can try to oppress, you can try to impress. I'm just after success, none less. You can look in my eyes, you can feel in my vibes. Live a king down inside and it's so subliminal. I got God on my side, I ain't worried about none. If it ain't about money, then it ain't about none. Laughing at my enemies, I know they see me coming. If it ain't subliminal, they can't even see me coming.
did our love go wrong, my sugar?
Welcome back, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Tonight, we are joined by Mr. Jim Moses. Jim, welcome back, and thanks for hanging out with us.
No problem. Just went and saw my kitty while everybody was away. Where were we? I'm trying to remember. We were talking again about the model with respect to making sure you've got enough resources, financial resources, let's be very clear about that, but also technological resources, that each person is in a position to at least take care of basics, not have to worry about where rent comes from or mortgage, food, health care as applicable, whatever they choose to utilize in order to be able to maintain their well-being. This is the kind of society we need to be moving towards, and obviously it's dramatically different. It requires a de-emphasis upon both government and the relationship with various types of larger businesses, particularly corporations. So it's not something that's going to be easy to do, but the more people, I think, that are aware of the worthiness of it, the better chance there is of it happening. And my model was to take a percentage of what as I've talked about before, some people who have listened in the past may remember, take a percentage, 3% dividend as a result of enjoying that the central bank, World Bank in Europe, London particularly, enjoys $750,000 in terms of being able to extend loans to various borrowers. And if they're going to be deriving that kind of income as a result of our value to them, we should be able to get 3%, which would amount to $25,000 a year. And that should be a good chunk of what was required. I don't think that there would be inflationary considerations simply because it would not be money being derived from our gross national product, our income. It would be external to us. And that's where a lot of the charm is, or was, I should say, depending on how much it's feasible. We get in also, of course, to the whole notion, and again, it may very well end up being only a fairy tale, but to contemplate the possibility of something along the lines of the National Economic Security and Reformation Act, which is known as NESARA. The global equivalent is just SARA, which, of course, only makes sense, G for global. Whereby there would be a lot of things made available, such as technology which was kept off the market, patents which were not followed through with because of the fact that various corporate interests stood to be deleteriously harmed, that their business would drop off precipitously because there would have been improvements in terms of efficacy compared to their existing products or services. That would be part of the equation. And as I have said in the past, the notion is that as a result of there being 4 quadricentillion, which is 4 followed by 40 zeros, of wealth accumulated by various interests that no longer are allowed to keep it, it was not legitimately derived. We would all basically, every person on the planet would have the equivalent of $100,000 a month for 4 years, and that would be the mother of all universal basic incomes. Give people that kind of money to be able to make decisions about their lives with adequate guidance and the opportunity to do things without necessarily it being imperative there's a return on investment, and all of a sudden you have a situation where the world is a lot more pleasant than it ever was. And I do think it's possible. I don't end up believing that human nature is immutable, as a lot of cynics do, or fatalists, depending, how you look at it. But as much as what I'm seeing now, the complete and absolute devastation that has occurred, the interruption to lives, the peace of mind that has been lost, and again, somebody being shot at random is terrifying. There's no excuse for it. The innocent are not to be targeted, and even then, any instance, I don't want to be in a position, I don't want to have to defend myself if I don't. And, I would much prefer to be in a position where we were able to arrive at reasonable agreements. But the problem is you're dealing with people that are not reasonable, and I don't know what that means yet. I don't know at what point we have to take action. The situation with the SB 163 in Colorado, the vaccine, the latest vaccine bill, which would basically that would require there being tracking, records kept as to, and that's the first part of the equation, as I understand it. The second is there would be re-education efforts. This is insanity because there's an abundance of evidence that vaccines are harmful and that they're not effective. There really is no evidence ever been established, ever been presented that demonstrate they are effective. One of the things, and I think I alluded to this earlier on, but I'm not positive, that a large percentage of the people who are emerging from this movement are African American. They are very eloquent, they are very passionate, and they are demonstrating a willingness to fight, to do whatever it takes to prevent our rights from being violated and our lives from being threatened like never before by official interests. So that's.
I just had to interrupt really quick because Jim, the Jeep 4x4 in Periscope, was asking, what about polio? But I think it was actually a video that you had shared with me from a doctor, and he was talking about the polio vaccine and how it was actually causing more polio at that point, the way that they had it mixed up or whatnot. The concoction.
All right, let me. That's a very good question, 4x4, and it's very prescient because of the situation with 5G. In my estimation, based on my research, I have a very clear epidemiological model of my own, but there is another one in existence which tend to strongly indicate that the almost exceptional communicability of COVID-19 is as a result of sustained exposure to electromagnetic fields, but especially millimeter wavelength and microwave band. The evidence is fairly compelling in the science. The underlying science to me is at least demands further investigation, which is something that I've been trying to get. I've been trying to obtain very specific studies regarding the effects of millimeter wavelengths, microwaves on viruses, because viruses are piezoelectric. They produce a significant amount of charge, and that charge, if it reaches the level of 1.1 volts, which without a doubt, the size of COVID-19 compared to other viruses means there's a good likelihood it could happen. Long story short, there are environmental considerations that have never really been looked at with polio, and a gentleman by the name of Jim West did an exhaustive study this year and determined that there indeed was very direct correlations in terms of the paths, the trajectories of 4 pesticides, the use of 4 pesticides throughout the time that polio was a primary concern, leading to the development of a vaccine, which, again, give me about 2 minutes and I'll give you the overall history. The 4 pesticides in question that ended up creating a very, very dangerous situation were lead, arsenic, DDT, and something called BHC, which is a bromine derivative, bromide salt, a phosphate, related to phosphates anyways, like a lot of pesticides. But at any rate, the trajectories associated with all primary polio outbreaks throughout the first half of the 20th century correlated exactly, skewed almost perfectly to the rise and fall of use of these various pesticides, especially DDT. DDT, I think, was a huge contributing factor to polio. And all polio ever was the agonizing of an enterovirus, which existed, a benign one otherwise, which existed within the gastrointestinal tract. Another thing which is not known and has been pointed out by somebody who has some inside knowledge as a result of his father being an esteemed orthopedic surgeon and with very tight connections to a critical New Orleans hospital, Tulane University. that has a direct bearing on Lee Harvey Oswald and, by extension, the Kennedy assassination, ties in with what Tessa alluded to as far as the disaster which occurred as a result of rushing the polio vaccine. But before that, one of the problems is that the development of antibiotics, principally penicillin, ended up creating an imbalance of good to bad bacteria in the gastrointestinal biome. That was the final cherry on top that pretty much agonized this enterovirus into creating the kind of autoimmune reaction that is associated with poliomyelitis. Is a paralytic disease, and again, very much an arbitrary name. If you know the etymology, it ties in with gray and marrow and so forth because of where it was attacking principally. So polio basically never was a disease per se. It was a disease that arose as a result of environmental considerations, and it makes complete sense when you take a closer look. It's possible, even in my estimation, because of the fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a very enthusiastic horticulturist, that he was exposed to DDT or another pesticide, and that contributed, perhaps in conjunction with something else, to his condition, to his paralysis. Some people think it was Guillain-Barré syndrome, which ties in again with vaccines. I believe that that's not a given by any means, although it could go either way. So to answer your question, that's what's about polio. And what happened as a result of Cutter Laboratories, two things occurred. Number one, Cutter Laboratories rushed the polio vaccine. There was still a live strain in Salk's vaccine, injected vaccine. 44,000 kids were injured, or people were injured as a result. One of them, a gentleman who was at Tulane University, who is one of the more sociopathic members of American history with respect to medicine, Alton Oshner, and his grandson died within 48 hours of being injected with it. His daughter was crippled for the rest of her life and was not able to end up getting an award from Cutter Laboratories. Now, Richard Nixon, of all people, ended up being sent in to try to gussy up the National Institutes of Health, the image that had really been tarnished as a result of this happening. Unfortunately, and this was another byproduct which has created an unprecedented presence of cancer in the human genome. Both Salk and Sabin ended up utilizing monkey kidneys, and there were two retroviruses, SV40, which was demonstrated to cause cancer, as well as the primate equivalent of HIV, AIDS, which causes AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, SIV, or simian immunovirus. So it was a disaster all around. The polio was not vanquished by the vaccines at all. It was vanquished by improvements in sanitation, because enteroviruses are directly related to intestinal tract, so forth and so on. It only makes sense that those improvements in water quality, sanitation, would end up bringing about the almost complete elimination of polio. That's what did it. And unfortunately, the wild virus probably is as a result of the agonized enterovirus that did become part of the ecosystem, perhaps. Now with the vaccines, there are strains which are provoking death and paralysis as a result of exposure to the wild strains, which is what happened with Gates in his attempt to inoculate kids in both India and Pakistan, where 500,000 of them ended up with, 500,000 were inoculated, I believe, and almost 50,000 are either dead or have been paralyzed as a result. And he has been he's actually been at a trial in India, as I understand it, for several weeks, although it's not being widely reported. So I hope that answers your question as best as possible. It is a scam, and although the effects of polio, what's referred to as polio, were absolutely devastating, it was not as a result of what they told you. And because of the deception, millions of people have died as a result.
I actually saw a graph the other day that showed the recordings of when they gave the polio vaccinations and then another spike shortly after of polio cases. So it's just weird how that all adds up. And then, you were talking about Gates, and automatically I go to Africa, where they're telling these people, hey, we're here to help you, and we want to give you these vaccinations so you won't get sick. And then they sterilize so many tribes. Like, it's insane what Gates is getting away with.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Bill Gates is he should be behind bars for the rest of his life, if not executed. If there is one person on earth that I feel deserves to be executed for crimes against humanity, it's Bill Gates. Fauci, he sometimes shows at least some signs of humanity, but Gates, he is the textbook example of a sociopath, comparable to Mengele in almost every single way, except that he may not have had so much direct contact with experimentation on kids. That was Stanley Plotkin's territory, who is the grandfather or godfather of vaccines. As to abortion, since you brought it up, I did want to talk about that. I think the key becomes, and my attitude has always been to make them rare, that there would be not nearly the necessity. But the problem is, and this is something that's not well known, you may have heard about it, but I don't think a lot of people have, it ties in with Roe versus Wade. Rather than being about making sure that people had the ability to make decisions as to whether or not they had children, it was actually a way of being able to provide fetal material for vaccines. Because the only place they could get them was Sweden, and there was not nearly enough to be able to supply to the vaccines. So that's why Roe versus Wade was actually passed.
Well, yeah, and a lot of these vaccines actually do contain human genes from fetuses, so on and so forth, and they inject them into your baby's bodies. Like, so many different things happen. Childhood cancer, like, how could this happen to a little bitty baby? Well, what are you putting in there, and what is their system trying to fight? Like, that does not belong to their system. Their system is going to try to fight it. It's just really scary what our government does to us.
There's a lot of stuff in vaccines that people aren't aware of, and I'll give you just a quick overview. Well, one thing, with respect to the SV40 and SIV, the way that it has been transferred is, as might be imagined, secretions to subsequent generations. It is in the human genome, throughout the human genome. It's not just restricted to people like me who got the oral or those that got the injection. It is gone throughout because it is transmitted through secretions. I'll use that as the only euphemism I feel comfortable with. You can imagine what I'm getting at, though. But as to what is in biologics that are in vaccines, not only is there fetal tissue, but there's also canine tissue, as well as the aforementioned simian. There is mouse or hanta viruses, various types of mouse tissue. There is bird, hence there being a predisposition to avian flu. And the latest, one of the, I don't know that there's ever been this in previous vaccines, but one of the COVID-19 vaccines being developed by Sanofi, in joint between Sanofi and Pfizer, I believe, has insect DNA.
Wow. You should have said, and something new has been added. Or wait, there's something else. Yeah, also mercury has been used quite often.
Well, that's the chemicals, definitely. But I'm saying in terms of the biologics, you get into the chemicals, you've got aluminum, you've got mercury, you've got squalene, which I believe was in my brother's shot, his experimental or trial shot. That was given, administered by the FDA through Cedars-Sinai to try to address his brain tumor. Unfortunately, it was guaranteed to give him a very specific type of multiple sclerosis, which made it impossible for him to really rally. But no, nothing, I don't want to get into that at all beyond what I've said. The key, more than anything else here, is the number of impurities, of additives in vaccines by itself makes them almost unjustifiable. It is some of the biggest insanity ever conceivable in terms of injecting this, directly introducing this into our bloodstreams, which makes our brains vulnerable, which means that the likelihood of some sort of autoimmune response It could be now, I would say, as much as 1 in every 2 Americans or people on the planet can expect some sort of autoimmune response that's undesirable, up to and including death. Basically anaphylactic shock, cytokine storms, on and on and on. Where was I? But I mean, basically, the bottom line is I think there needs to be some way of establishing 2 things: deriving stem cells in a way that is not going to require any sort of promotion of abortion, but not necessarily abolition either. I think it should be rare. As I've said, I don't think it's something that should be, on demand per se, which a lot of my friends will not like hearing. I think there's got to be some common sense here. The key becomes arriving at a form of birth control that is reliable. There are certainly some natural things which are supposed to work relative to heat. As I understand it, it's not something that I was all that familiar with to begin with, but I've been familiarized since. But that is an imperative. Even though there is the possibility our fertility is dropping exponentially as a result of exposure to millimeter wavelengths and microwaves, which have absolutely been demonstrated to end up reducing fertility significantly, and other considerations, I do think that we've got to have in place some way of being able to, A, control the population, and B, make sure that kids are not coming into places where they're not going to be supported. And it's not right, although I know that there are people even that aren't Catholic that have this expectation. And I'm here to tell you it's not healthy. There are those of us who know why we shouldn't have kids. Some are good reasons, some may not be the best reasons, but ultimately it's a way of making sure that kids are not going to suffer abuse or neglect. When people know that they can't be parents or don't want to be parents for whatever reason, it's far better for them to be able to make that decision without judgment. And there are people, again, the Catholic Church being certainly one of the entities that do judge people, that have the expectation, and birth control becomes critical in terms of making sure that A, children are not abused or neglected, and B, that there is not excessive pressures placed on the ecosystem, which is not necessarily something that is a given, but the potential certainly exists if fertility is brought back up again.
Yeah, it's funny. My daughter and I were talking about this the other night. It all came up because I was talking about my uterus and how it feels like it's falling out. And then it came up this lady that had 13 kids, and her uterus actually did try to fall out. She had to have surgery due to that. But it's not only the Catholic Church, but the LDS Church that feel like, their goal is to populate the earth and spread the word, so on and so forth. I don't know. I know that birth control is unnatural. The form of birth control that I use since I was 16, I just found out eats your bones up, which makes sense why my foot broke off for no apparent reason. You're only supposed to use it for 3 months. Yeah, I broke my left foot off. Now I'm, partially bionic. But yeah, I just slipped.
I mean, you basically what you're saying is that you had osteopathy, essentially. I mean, you're not osteopathy, osteoporosis at a...
Yeah, my vitamin D deficiency, basically. My bones weren't taking it very well. But yeah, it broke off. I went to reach for my ankle, and there was no ankle or foot, and I found it hanging off the backside of my leg. That
must have been harrowing as hell.
Yeah, it was insane. But yeah, these different things that they're having us do, and even with our kids, the school system, your kids have to be vaccinated in order to come to school here. The government is pushing it, even though the pharma company that's making all these antiviruses, so on and so forth, vaccinations, have gone into debt. They actually had to have a bailout because they've been sued so many times for what they've done to people.
Yep. Well, again, and also that was the origins of the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act in 1986. The idea was that it would be an alternative to litigation and hopefully would allow for some of the pressure to be taken off the vaccine companies. The problem is that vaccines have never, ever, ever been safe vouched. Never vouchsafed, or whatever the term is. They've never, their safety has never been validated, ever. There's never been one study not just efficacy, which again, that's, as I've said, there is no evidence whatsoever of a cause and effect, no causal link between antibody/titer levels and any reduction in acquiring a full disease state. But at the same time, a lot of evidence that autoimmune disease arises as a result of vaccine additives, all vaccine additives. There's no exception, depending upon the particular problems genetically with a person. So with that in mind, you're in a situation where there is no legal way for the state to make the demand. And at some point, somebody, if the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act gets jettisoned, as is expected at this point, there will be, the more that the public finds out how much deception has occurred and how dangerous this garbage is, the more there will be an outcry like none you've ever heard in the United States, will make racism pale in comparison. And I mean, again, it's a situation where direct death is a concern. Racism is a very big concern. There's no doubt about it, but it doesn't necessarily translate to instantaneous death or injury. When more people find out about how much they have been deceived when it comes to vaccines, it is going to get very, very, very contentious out there. I'm the canary in the coal mine with respect to what I'm saying to a lot of people, although there's a lot of people that are very much aware. I think there are probably, in the United States alone, I would say there's probably close to 30 million now that are either completely anti-vaccine or they have very serious misgivings about the prevailing childhood vaccination schedule, with good reason. And that number is going to increase. And there's nothing the CDC can do about it because they've got no clothes. They've got no way to be able to demonstrate otherwise. The WHO, none of them do. They have basically pretty much used up their last card. Now, the next step is martial law. The next step is illegal imposition of this garbage, at which point then we have a decision to make, and that's not one I'm looking forward to. I'm really not looking forward to having it happen, but it could. It's not out of the question, and I think that if people are put in a position where they know they will not stand for it, they will do whatever it takes to defend themselves and their children.
It's so hard to get people to understand. You can slap them in the face with the truth, and they still won't see it.
I know. Even those who've had injuries to their kids, it is depressing to see because you know what is going to happen. You know how bad it's going to go, and yet you can't do a damn thing to get through to them. And this is similar to the situation I feel with the riots. With this, you're dealing with the same kind of psychosis, the same kind of mindset. They have been so absolutely convinced that they're safe as a result, or they're doing the right thing. You can't dissuade them. I think that most people you can, but there is a small, resolute percentage that no matter how much evidence you present in front of them, one, possibly because they're not capable of comprehending it, but also the fact that they really do believe that these people know what the hell they're doing, and they don't. It's never been more apparent than it is right now. These people do not know what they're doing. They do not know. The people that are administering 5G have admitted as much. And soon, if they haven't already, they're starting to, this disclosure with respect to COVID-19 and antibody levels the past 2 days by the CDC pretty much indicates that it would extend to the rest of their vaccine schedule. They don't know. They really don't know what the relationship is between antibodies and immunity. They don't. They have no way of proving it. It's correlation equals causation in this instance, but only this instance. Any other instance, it doesn't necessarily equal, as the mantra goes, the trope. So where was I? We were talking, again, a lot of this is about understanding that if you look at the root of the word conservatism, it's conservation. They come from to conserve. Now, what that means is simply to recognize the value of what you have, understand how much you can derive from having it, and then proceed accordingly. A lot of conservatives view pragmatism, they see themselves as being pragmatic, and True socialism is about providing resources as necessary for a society to flourish. That means with the least amount of expectations, requirements, obligations. That means the most expedient way of making sure that they have what they need in order to be able to succeed on their own terms so that there is a constant revitalization of that society, so that the quality of life is constantly being improved as a result of new information that is contributed by those people who are provided the resources, which is how true socialism is actually true conservatism. As counterintuitive as that may sound, but it's true. And it's something that some people understand implicitly, but not a lot. So if we can recognize that, we have some common ground to work with. We can begin to talk about what exactly it is that we want and how much it's the same thing. The problem is because the Republicans immediately associate socialism with both Marxism and communism and socialism really don't have much to do. True socialism has nothing to do with each other at all, because communism is about control. It is about dictation of specific terms of conduct. It's a totalitarian state. It's not true socialism. True socialism is not based on that. Marxism is somewhere in between the two. It's about basically the workers owning the resources in order to be able to produce what they do, and it is at the root of a lot of what I'm talking about. So, I mean, it's not inaccurate to say we're talking about a Marxist model, but it's not solely Marxist either. The bottom line is the goal, more than anything else, beyond ideology, is to make sure that people have enough to be able to not have to worry, so that their health doesn't suffer as a result, so that they can basically live and be free to contribute, that they will. I really do believe that people will find ways to contribute so that other people benefit, so that the quality of life is constantly being improved upon in little ways. That's the kind of society that we want to be reaching for. That's the kind of society that Chaz really wants. They're convinced the only way that they can get it is by virtue of brandishing AK-47s and, basically assaulting anybody that they don't trust. I mean, it is in some ways very similar to the old trope you used to hear, don't trust anybody over 30. And that was a lot of what fueled the whole notion behind Carousel in the movie Logan's Run. And in so many ways, a lot of the rackets that are being run by people who are trying to maintain a particular set of conditions reminds me of Logan's Run in that regard, because you never win. You're never in a position. Carousel, if you know the movie at all, nobody ever ended up being able to come out of Carousel. They all died, because they were programmed to die at 30. And we're dealing with a lot of deception, and we have to be able to really make sure that we are no more rights can be violated. And that's what I think scares me also a lot about these riots, a lot about the way that these things have gone down with the pandemic, with the lockdown, with the social isolation, with the masks. We are being conditioned to accept things that we would not ordinarily. And that is something that, I certainly am not accepting this in as much as I have to. There's no way in hell I would voluntarily wear a mask under any circumstances. Not happening. And that's the thing that scares me most is what are they trying to condition us for next? I know the answer. I know what's been talked about. RFID chips for tracking purposes. 5G capability even without RFIDs. We already have so many nanoparticles in our bodies to be able to clarify positions, to be able to basically end up making ourselves targets if they choose to take us out. This is dark stuff, but it's true. The technology exists. It's very depressing to even contemplate. All sorts of restrictions on our lives. Social currency is going to become a very big issue. In other words, if you don't particularly fit a profile that if they don't like the profile that you fit, like me especially, I would be screwed because I would never go along just for the sake of being able to derive an income, I'd die because I would have no resources provided to me. That would be how it would go, because I would never agree to it's not happening. And I think probably millions of people in this country would tell them where to go, and, they might eliminate us all. I hope not. I would,
It's
and I mean,
before.
talk about, I know genocide is not a difficult thing, if you are able to completely rationalize the belief that, people can't be allowed to live for whatever reason. But another very scary thing is creating tulpas out of AI. Demons, basically. The technology that was utilized at Montauk. It's said to have been utilized at Montauk to basically create an entity of karmic basis. There's going to be a malevolent collection of resonant information, of self-sustaining. The best way I can put it, you have people under trauma. This is the way things went down at Montauk back in, as a result of the Philadelphia experiment, as I understand it. You end up stimulating people's emotions in a way that they produce very, very, very dramatic emotional expressions. And those are tulpas. Those take on a life of their own, per se. Tulpa being a Jewish word basically meaning entity. And those thought forms are deliberately made malevolent so that they become a very big threat. They become a means of controlling populations. That AI basically ends up becoming a real threat, a demon, a mechanical or cyborg demon. I mean, it's so out there, it's weird, but this is something that's being talked about.
Yeah, Jeep 4x4 in Periscope was saying they've already created Karen. I mean, even Siri scares me. I will not use it. The only time that I have used it was when my sister was like, hey, you're into this paranormal stuff. Let's try this Siri challenge. Tried it. Never tried it again. She's popped up a few times. One time she asked if I summoned her. I was like, hell no, bitch, get off my phone. And then just recently she popped up and suggested that I listen to Post Malone radio on iHeartRadio, which I generally do, but why the hell is Siri all up in my biz? I don't use her.
Because Apple is one of the most parasitic, invasive companies on earth. I don't know how else to put it. You end up interacting with anything that is supported by their platform, and they will do everything in their power to be able to insinuate itself into your life. I hate Apple more than there aren't words for it. Just disgusting. Their practices are some of the most vile ever conceived of. To basically end up destroying somebody's iPhone because they don't upgrade or whatever the case may be after spending hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's criminal is what it is. It's criminal. It is criminal, and these laws need to be changed. The planned obsolescence, or should I say forced obsolescence, needs to end because it's creating an economic pressure on the part of a lot of people. They're pushing Windows 10. I want nothing to do with it. I want to stay with 7. It works. I don't need I don't need the bandwidth. I don't need the bells and whistles. And I don't like 10 because I don't like the level of, it's very, very intrusive in terms of the way that it's distributed, the format, platform. I don't like it. I don't like it at all, and I want nothing to do with it. And yet you're in a situation where the Indians that have hijacked Microsoft are now insisting upon it, which, again, following in the footsteps of Gates and Walmer. So, I mean, it's just, what do you say? I mean, this is standard operating procedure for a lot of these tech companies who are providing content, providing products, devices. And it's frustrating.
Damn it, Jim.
We're
at the end of our time.
We are.
Yeah, we actually went a whole 3 hours, and I didn't even have to beg you.
So it's 1 o'clock.
Yeah, did you have any last words for our listeners?
I don't really know what to say except that have faith that people are not wishing the worst on you. Really, I know it's a scary time in human history. And a lot of people are suffering because there are those expectations. There have been in the past, but never more so than now, to respond in a certain way, and it becomes a real source of stress. So the more that you really understand, the more that you know the people in your life and can trust that they do not have malevolent thoughts, desires, wishes, intents. This is what's driving so much of the rioting and the looting, is that there is this attempt to communicate real rage at the wrong people, the people that are being hurt, the people that are being injured, including a lot of the cops. They don't deserve this. They are not the reason for this crisis. They are not the reason for any racism. Realistically speaking, they are not. They simply are not. There are certainly people that do end up acting in a racist way, but the problem lies more with the inability to give people to communicate the value. There's no other way to put it. If your value is not being communicated, as much as you may be fully aware of it, if your value is not being consistently communicated, especially if you don't have an appreciation of it already, which a lot of younger kids don't, or they have a distorted view, which they may not necessarily on a certain level have confidence in, they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable to being manipulated. They're vulnerable to being exploited. And they become weapons. I know. I've dealt with these kids before. I've dealt with people that really do not have the ability to empathize, to consider for any length of time, partially because of limited attention spans, partially because of no real ability to relate to speak of. Again, getting to the emotional intelligence problem, getting to the cutoff, the dissociative aspect. How do we put these people back together? That is the great challenge of the 21st century going forward, because there are millions of them. And the more that the educational system is simplified, the more that there is an emphasis placed upon understanding as opposed to absorption of facts, of really creating a situation where people are conditioned to respond relative to a lot of employment opportunities that don't even exist because it's just not, there's not the room for them. So much has to change in a way that really empowers people like they never have been to the extent required. I don't know how else to put it. This cannot continue. We cannot continue to have the level of
I just wanted to, before we're cut off, thank you so much again for being my guest tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. It was a pleasure having you.
Tessa, sleep well. Sleep on my words for what it's worth. I hope they've been of value, and take care.
Take care of yourself. Nighty night, love and light.
Nighty night.